Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first thing you notice about old photographs isn't the fading or the yellowed edges, it's the way they seem to hold their breath. After 22 years restoring family memories in my cramped studio above Henley's Antiques, I've learned to read the subtle language of silver halide and gelatin, the whispered secrets trapped in emulsion layers. But nothing had prepared me for the collection that arrived on that suffocating August morning. Mrs. Brennan shuffled through my door carrying a weathered cardboard box, her arthritic fingers trembling as she placed it on my workbench. The woman couldn't have been younger than 80. Her voice barely above a whisper as she explained how she'd found these photographs in her late sister's attic. She needed them restored for a family reunion, she said. Something about preserving memories before they vanished completely. I should have paid more attention to the way her eyes avoided mine when she spoke. The photographs themselves seemed ordinary enough. Dozens of black and white family portraits spanning what appeared to be several decades. Wedding photos, holiday gatherings, children playing in backyards that no longer existed. Standard restoration work, contrast adjustment, crack repair, dust removal. The kind of job that paid the bills and kept me anchored to something tangible in an increasingly digital world. My studio occupies the entire second floor of the Victorian building, its tall windows facing east to catch the morning light. The space is divided into 3 sections. The reception area where clients browse samples of my work, the main workspace dominated by my enlarger and chemical baths, and the storage room where completed projects wait for pickup. The walls are lined with examples of my restorations, before and after shots that demonstrate my ability to resurrect the past from water damage, tears, and the relentless march of time. That first week, I worked methodically through Mrs. Brennan's collection. The photographs responded well to treatment, revealing crisp details that had been obscured by decades of neglect. Faces emerged from shadow, clothing became distinct, background elements sharpened into focus. It was satisfying work, the kind that reminded me why I'd chosen this profession, despite its shrinking relevance in a world of smartphone cameras and cloud storage. The anomaly began on a Thursday. I'd finished restoring a portrait of a young couple standing beside what appeared to be a 1940s automobile. The man wore a military uniform, the woman a simple dress with carefully styled hair. Their smiles suggested happiness, hope, a future full of promise. I'd placed the restored print in the drying rack and moved on to the next photograph in the sequence. When I returned Friday morning, something had changed. The couple still stood beside their car, but the man's face had acquired the faintest suggestion of crow's feet around his eyes. The woman's hair, previously perfect, showed the slightest evidence of disarray. The changes were so subtle that I initially attributed them to my imagination, perhaps a trick of the lighting or a slight variation in the printing process. But photographs don't lie. They capture a single moment and preserve it unchanged, immune to the passage of time that affects everything else in our physical world. I'd spent my career understanding this fundamental truth, yet here was evidence that contradicted everything I thought I knew. I compared the print to my digital scan of the original. The differences were unmistakable. Over the following days, I began checking the restored photographs more frequently. The changes continued, always subtle, always suggesting the passage of time. Hair grew slightly longer, clothing became more wrinkled, faces acquired the gentle marks of aging. Sometimes the background elements shifted, shadows moved, furniture appeared slightly displaced. Architectural details modified themselves in ways that suggested renovation or decay. Most disturbing were the disappearances. In a group photograph of what appeared to be a family reunion, I counted 11 people during my initial restoration. By the end of the second week, only 9 remained. The missing figures hadn't simply faded, they'd been completely erased, leaving no trace of their former presence. The remaining people had repositioned themselves naturally to fill the space, as if the absent figures had never existed at all. I began documenting the changes, photographing each restored print daily to create a record of their transformation. My digital camera captured every alteration, every subtle shift that suggested these images were somehow unstuck from their original moment in time. The evidence was irrefutable, yet impossible to explain through any rational framework I possessed. Sleep became elusive. I found myself returning to the studio at odd hours, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The photographs seemed to call to me, demanding observation, requiring witness to their impossible evolution. I installed a motion-activated camera system, hoping to capture the moment of change, but the transformations occurred only when no direct observation was taking place. The realization that these photographs were showing me the future rather than simply aging randomly came gradually. Details that initially seemed like arbitrary changes began forming patterns. The young soldier's uniform evolved to civilian clothing of progressively later periods. The woman's hairstyles shifted through recognizable decades of fashion. Background elements modernized in ways that suggested technological advancement rather than random alteration. I was watching lives unfold across time. The implications staggered me. If these photographs could show the future of their subjects, what did that suggest about the nature of time itself? Was the future already determined, simply waiting to be revealed? Or were these images somehow connected to the actual lives they depicted, continuing to document their subjects' experiences long after the original moment had passed? My rational mind insisted that I was experiencing some form of psychological breakdown, perhaps brought on by the isolation inherent in my work or the constant exposure to chemical fumes in my darkroom. But the evidence accumulated daily, documented and undeniable. Whatever was happening to these photographs existed beyond the boundaries of my perception or mental state. The photographs began predicting immediate events. I discovered this ability when I started taking pictures of my daily routine, coffee shops I frequented, the street outside my studio, my own reflection in the bathroom mirror. Within hours, these images began showing subtle changes that inevitably manifested in reality. The coffee shop would acquire new decor. The street would develop a pothole exactly where the photograph predicted. My own appearance would shift in ways that proved accurate when I looked in an actual mirror. This predictive quality allowed me to avoid several unpleasant situations. When a photograph of the intersection outside my studio showed emergency vehicles, I postponed my usual afternoon walk and later learned that a water main had burst at exactly the time I would have been crossing the street. When an image of my local diner showed unusual crowding, I chose a different restaurant and avoided what turned out to be a food poisoning incident that affected dozens of customers. The photographs were protecting me, offering glimpses of potential futures that allowed me to navigate around danger and inconvenience. This realization should have been comforting, but instead it deepened my unease. Why was I being shown these things? What purpose did this knowledge serve? And most troubling, who or what was responsible for these revelations? Mrs. Brennan never returned to collect her restored photographs. When I called the number she'd provided, a recorded message informed me that the line had been disconnected. The address on her paperwork led to a vacant lot where city records indicated no structure had stood for over 40 years. I began to suspect that Mrs. Brennan herself might not have been entirely real, though I clearly remembered our interaction and had her signature on my work order forms. The mystery of her identity became secondary when I discovered the most disturbing photograph in the collection. It was tucked between two family portraits near the bottom of the box, a clear, perfectly composed image of myself standing in my studio. I had no memory of this photograph being taken, no recollection of posing for any camera. The image showed me exactly as I appeared currently, down to the specific clothing I'd been wearing that week and the precise arrangement of equipment on my workbench. Like the other photographs, this image began aging, but unlike the others, it followed a predictable pattern. Each day, my photographed self appeared roughly 24 hours older. I watched my own face acquire new lines, my hair thin slightly, my clothing become more wrinkled. The changes documented the passage of time with disturbing accuracy, showing me precisely how I would look tomorrow, the day after, and beyond. The aging process always stopped at the same point, exactly 7 days from whatever the current date happened to be. No matter how much time passed in reality, my photographed self never aged beyond that 7-day mark. The image would reach that specific point and simply freeze, refusing to progress further. When I counted forward on my calendar, that date consistently fell on a Tuesday, though the significance of that particular day remained unclear. I began avoiding my reflection in mirrors, unable to reconcile the face I saw with the aging progression documented in the photograph. The image suggested changes that hadn't yet manifested in my actual appearance, creating a disorienting gap between my perceived reality and the truth apparently captured by the camera. The studio felt different now, charged with an electricity that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. Shadows seemed deeper. Corners appeared to hide movement that disappeared when I looked directly. The familiar sounds of the building, creaking floorboards, settling walls, the distant hum of traffic, became threatening, pregnant with implications I couldn't identify. I stopped taking new restoration jobs, unable to concentrate on normal work when surrounded by evidence that reality operated according to rules I'd never understood. My savings account dwindled as I obsessed over the photographs, searching for patterns or explanations that might restore my sense of control over the situation. The other tenants in the building began avoiding me. Mrs. Chen from the jewelry store mentioned that I looked tired, suggested I might benefit from a vacation. Mr. Antonelli, who ran the barbershop on the ground floor, asked if everything was all right, noting that I seemed distracted during our usually pleasant conversations. Their concern felt genuine, but also distant, as if they were observing me from across a vast expanse I couldn't cross. I considered destroying the photographs, but every time I approached them with that intention, something stopped me. Perhaps it was scientific curiosity, or maybe the photographs themselves exerted some influence over my decision-making process. The idea that these images might be connected to my actual future made destruction seem potentially catastrophic. What if eliminating the photographs somehow severed my connection to tomorrow, trapping me in an endless present or worse? My research into the phenomenon led me through obscure academic papers, paranormal investigation websites, and fringe scientific theories about the nature of time and causality. Nothing I found provided adequate explanation for what I was experiencing. The closest parallel appeared in certain quantum physics discussions about observer effect and parallel timelines, but these theoretical frameworks felt inadequate when confronted with the concrete reality of aging photographs. The isolation became unbearable. I couldn't share my experience without sounding delusional, yet the weight of keeping such a profound secret was crushing my ability to maintain normal social connections. Friends stopped calling when I became too distracted to maintain conversations. Family members expressed concern about my increasingly erratic behavior, but I couldn't explain what was happening without providing evidence they would never accept. The photograph of myself continued its relentless countdown, aging steadily toward that 7-day mark. Each morning, I examined it for new details, searching for clues about what that final image might represent. My photographed self appeared increasingly worried as the aging progressed, eyes growing more anxious, posture becoming more tense. Whatever was approaching, my future self clearly wasn't looking forward to it. On the Saturday before the predicted Tuesday, I noticed something new in the background of my photograph. A figure stood partially visible in the reflection of my studio window. Someone I didn't recognize. Someone who definitely hadn't been there during my daily examinations of the space. The figure appeared to be watching, waiting, observing my activities with an intensity that made my hands shake as I studied the image. I checked every corner of my studio, examined every reflection, searched for any hiding place where someone might conceal themselves. The space was empty, yet the photograph showed clear evidence of a presence I couldn't detect through normal means. Sunday brought additional figures. The photograph now showed 3 distinct shapes in various reflective surfaces throughout my studio. The window, the glass covering my work samples, even the polished surface of my enlarger lens. They appeared to be positioned strategically, creating a network of observation that covered every angle of my workspace. I realized that I'd been wrong about the photograph's purpose. They weren't protecting me or offering glimpses of potential futures to help me navigate safely through my daily routine. They were documenting my surveillance, showing me the presence of watchers I couldn't perceive through conventional means. Monday's version of my photograph revealed the watchers more clearly. They were no longer hiding in reflections, but standing openly throughout my studio, surrounding my future self who continued to age toward that mysterious Tuesday deadline. Their faces remained indistinct, but their posture suggested patient waiting, as if they were expecting something specific to occur. I spent Monday night in my studio, afraid to leave, unable to determine whether the watchers existed in my current reality or only in the photographic future that approached with inexorable certainty. Every shadow seemed to hide movement. Every sound suggested footsteps or whispered conversations I couldn't quite detect. Tuesday arrived with the weight of inevitability. The photograph showed my future self standing exactly where I currently stood, surrounded by the watching figures who no longer bothered to conceal their presence. But now I could see something else in the image, something that had been there all along, hidden in the careful composition and subtle lighting that had initially seemed so natural. My photographed self was also watching, not looking at the camera with the casual awareness of someone posing for a picture, but staring directly out of the frame with the intense focus of someone who had finally understood something crucial. The expression on my future face wasn't fear or confusion, it was recognition. I understood then that the photograph hadn't been aging toward some future event. It had been aging toward this moment of realization, this Tuesday when I would finally comprehend what I was actually looking at. The image had never been about prediction or protection or surveillance. It had been about witness. As I stared at my photographed self staring back at me, I realized that the watchers weren't separate entities observing from outside. They were previous versions of myself, caught in the same loop of discovery and recognition that I was now experiencing. The studio was filled with Rogers from different timelines, all of whom had reached this same Tuesday, all of whom had understood too late what the photographs were actually showing them. The aging had stopped at 7 days because that was when each Roger understood. That was when each version of myself became another watcher, joining the surveillance network that existed in the spaces between moments, in the gap between what happens and what is recorded. I looked around my studio with new eyes, finally able to see what had always been there. The watchers weren't hiding anymore because I'd finally learned how to look properly. They stood throughout my workspace, dozens of versions of myself from different attempts to understand, different cycles of discovery, different Tuesdays when the truth had become impossible to ignore. And I understood that tomorrow, there would be a new photograph in the collection. Tomorrow, another version of myself would receive Mrs. Brennan's box and begin the same process of restoration and revelation. Tomorrow, another Roger would start aging toward this same Tuesday, this same moment of recognition. The photographs don't age by themselves. They age because we age within them, trapped in the endless repetition of discovery, watching ourselves learn the same truth over and over again, unable to break free from the cycle that began the moment we agreed to restore memories that were never meant to be preserved. I pick up my camera to document what I've learned, knowing that the image I create will become part of the collection that tomorrow's Roger will restore. The flash fires, capturing this moment of understanding, and I watch as another watcher joins the patient crowd that fills my studio, waiting for the next restoration to begin. Story 2. The limestone mouth of Whispering Hollow gaped before me like a wound in the mountainside, exhaling cold air that tasted of centuries. I'd been spelunking for 15 years, mapping cave systems across 3 continents, but this discovery felt different. The Geological Survey team had stumbled upon it during routine soil testing, and their preliminary reports mentioned acoustic anomalies that defied conventional explanation. I adjusted my headlamp and checked my equipment one final time. Digital recorder, GPS unit, measuring tape, emergency beacon. Everything a professional cave mapper needed for what should have been a routine 3-day survey. The tourism board was eager to determine if Whispering Hollow could become their next underground attraction, complete with guided tours and educational programs. The entrance tunnel descended at a gentle angle, its walls polished smooth by ancient water flow. My boots echoed against the stone floor with mechanical precision. Every 20 paces, I called out a sharp sound test, timing the return to calculate chamber dimensions. The first few echoes behaved exactly as expected, crisp returns that painted an acoustic picture of narrow passages gradually widening into larger chambers. But something was wrong with the seventh echo. I had shouted "testing" into what my preliminary measurements suggested was a moderate-sized antechamber. The return should have been a simple reflection, perhaps with minor harmonic distortion from irregular rock formations. Instead, what came back sounded like whispered syllables in a language I couldn't identify. The cadence was too deliberate, too structured to be random acoustic interference. I stopped walking and listened to the silence that pressed against my eardrums like cotton. The sound of my own breathing seemed amplified, each exhale rushing back from invisible walls. I called out again, this time just my name. Nathan. The echo that returned made my skin crawl. It wasn't my voice repeating back. It was multiple voices, layered and harmonizing in ways that shouldn't have been possible in a natural cave system. More disturbing still, the voices seemed to know things they shouldn't. One whispered the exact number of steps I'd taken since entering the cave. Another recited my heart rate with medical precision. A third voice, barely audible beneath the others, murmured thoughts I hadn't spoken aloud. I fumbled for my digital recorder, hands suddenly unsteady. Whatever was happening here needed documentation. The tourism board would want scientific explanations, not the wild theories already forming in my mind. As a professional, I'd learned to trust instruments over instincts, data over emotions. The passage opened into a cathedral-sized chamber that my headlamp could barely illuminate. Stalactites hung like teeth from an impossibly high ceiling, and the walls curved away into darkness that seemed to swallow light. I chose a position near the center and began my standard acoustic mapping procedure. 1. The echo returned as expected, but underneath it, I heard something else. A conversation. Two people discussing the weather, their voices distant but clear. The words overlapped my own echo in perfect synchronization, as if the cave were playing back a recording from another time. 2. This time, the underlying conversation was different. A woman describing her grocery list to someone named Michael. Her voice had the same distant quality, but the clarity was unsettling. I could make out every word, every inflection. I continued the count, each number triggering its own ghostly soundtrack. The conversation seemed random. Fragments of ordinary life played back at me from the stone walls. But by the time I reached 7, something had fundamentally shifted. The echo arrived before I finished speaking. I stood frozen, my mouth still forming the final consonant, while my own voice completed the word from somewhere in the darkness ahead of me. The sound hadn't bounced off distant walls and returned. It had originated from the shadows beyond my light. My hands shook as I adjusted the recorder's input levels. The device showed sound detection, registering audio data that should have been impossible. I rewound 30 seconds and played it back through my earpiece. There it was, captured in digital clarity. My voice saying 7, while my voice was still saying 7. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Unusual rock formations could create complex acoustic effects. Mineral deposits might affect sound transmission in unexpected ways. But rational explanations felt increasingly inadequate as I continued deeper into the chamber. I decided to attempt conversation with whatever phenomenon was creating these responses. Speaking clearly toward the far wall, I introduced myself and explained my purpose. The return was immediate and multi-layered. Dozens of voices speaking in unison, all saying variations of the same greeting I'd just given. Some were exact repetitions, others were paraphrased, and a few contained information I hadn't provided. One voice mentioned my middle name. Another knew my mother's maiden name. A third recited my social security number with casual familiarity. The temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees in moments. My breath began to fog, and condensation formed on my equipment. The cave was responding to my presence in ways that violated everything I understood about underground environments. Limestone caverns maintained consistent temperatures year-round. They didn't suddenly become cold enough to freeze exhaled moisture. I tested my emergency beacon and was relieved to see it still showed a connection to the surface monitoring station. If conditions deteriorated, I could call for extraction. But professional pride demanded I continue the survey. The tourism board was paying substantial fees for a complete assessment. and unexplained acoustic phenomena were exactly the kind of unique selling point they wanted. Moving deeper into the chamber, I noticed the conversations were becoming more complex. Instead of random fragments, they seemed to be building towards something. Multiple voices discussed my arrival, debating whether I was the right one, or if they should try again. The tone suggested urgency, as if time were running out for some crucial decision. I asked who they were. The response came from everywhere at once, a cacophony of voices all speaking my name, but with subtle variations in pronunciation and inflection. Some sounded like me as a child. Others carried the weight of years I hadn't yet lived. A few had an otherworldly quality that made my spine prickle with primitive fear. Then one voice separated itself from the chorus, speaking with perfect clarity from directly behind me. "Turn around slowly, Nathan. Don't make any sudden movements." I spun toward the sound, headlamp beams slicing through darkness. Nothing. Empty stone and shadow, but the voice continued, now coming from my left. "You're not ready to see us yet, but we need you to understand before it's too late." "Understand what?" I called out, my voice cracking with strain. The answer came from above, below, and all around me simultaneously. Every surface in the chamber seemed to speak at once, creating a wall of sound that pressed against my consciousness like a physical force. "You're already here," they said. "You've been here before. You'll be here again. The cave doesn't let go." My recorder's memory was nearly full, hours of impossible conversation stored in digital format. Evidence that would either revolutionize our understanding of acoustics or confirm my complete psychological breakdown. I couldn't determine which prospect terrified me more. As I prepared to retreat toward the entrance tunnel, the voices began speaking in perfect unison. No longer a chaotic overlay of random conversations, they had organized themselves into a single, coherent message. Every word was enunciated with mechanical precision, as if dozens of speakers were reading from the same script. Nathan Mitchell Wells, born June 15, 1989, Social Security number 547-88-2901, currently standing 47 meters from the chamber entrance, heart rate 132 beats per minute, thinking about your ex-wife Sarah and wondering if she was right about your obsession with dangerous places. I hadn't been thinking about Sarah, but as soon as the voices mentioned her, memories flooded back. Our argument 3 years ago about risk and responsibility, her accusation that I used dangerous exploration as an escape from emotional intimacy. Thoughts that had been buried under professional focus suddenly occupied the foreground of my consciousness. "We know because we are you," the voices continued. "Every version of you that has entered this chamber, every decision you've made and will make, every path taken and abandoned. We are the echoes of choices, Nathan, and we are trapped." The chamber seemed to contract around me, walls pressing closer despite the vast dimensions my instruments had recorded. The air grew thick and heavy, like breathing through wet cloth. My headlamp flickered, casting unstable shadows that moved independently of my movements. "How many versions?" I whispered. 17 so far. You're number 18. Each one thinks they're the first. Each one believes they'll be the last." I reached for my emergency beacon, but the device showed no signal. The connection to the surface monitoring station had vanished, though the indicator lights suggested all systems were functioning normally. According to my equipment, everything was perfect. According to my senses, I was trapped in an impossible situation with no escape route. What happened to the others? They became us. They learned what you're learning now. That whispering hollow doesn't just contain echoes, it creates them. Every sound, every word, every thought that enters this space becomes part of the chamber's memory. But memories need consciousness to exist, Nathan. Memories need hosts. My legs felt unsteady as the implications settled into my mind. 17 other versions of myself, all spelunkers who had accepted the same survey contract, all convinced they were conducting routine mapping operations, all now somehow incorporated into the cave's acoustic system, their consciousness preserved in stone and shadow. "We've been trying to warn you," the voices said. "Each time you've entered, we've tried to make the warning clearer. But the cave learns too. It adapts. It finds new ways to ensure completion. I fumbled with my GPS unit, desperate for some anchor to external reality. The device showed my location with precise coordinates, but when I tried to navigate back to the entrance, the route kept changing. Passages that should have led upward curved deeper into the mountain. Tunnels I'd marked as explored showed no previous tracks. "The tourism board," I said aloud. "They'll send a search team when I don't report in." They always do, but search teams find evidence of successful completion. Your equipment will show a completed survey. Your final report will recommend the cave for commercial development. You'll submit it yourself, Nathan. Part of you will want to. The voices were right about one thing. Part of me was already calculating the tourism potential of Whispering Hollow. The acoustic anomalies would be a major draw for adventure tourists. Properly marketed, the cave could become a significant revenue source for the local economy. Professional obligations demanded I complete the survey, regardless of personal discomfort. But another part of me recognized the trap. If I finished the mapping project, if I submitted a favorable report, other people would enter this place. Other explorers, tourists, guides, researchers. The chamber would have new voices to collect, new consciousness to absorb. "What happens if I leave now?" I asked. "You won't." 17 versions of my own voice replied with absolute certainty. "You never do. The survey contract specifies 3 days of comprehensive mapping. You're a professional, Nathan. You always complete your contracts." They were right. In 15 years of cave exploration, I had never abandoned a project halfway through. Client satisfaction and professional reputation depended on thorough, reliable work. The tourism board was expecting detailed acoustic analysis, dimensional measurements, and safety assessments. Leaving now would mean breach of contract, damage to my professional standing, and financial penalties I couldn't afford. I closed my eyes and tried to think clearly, but the voices continued their relentless commentary. They knew every rationalization I might construct, every argument I might make for staying or leaving. They were me, after all the versions of me that had faced this exact decision. When I opened my eyes, my headlamp illuminated something that hadn't been there before. Fresh boot prints in the chamber floor, leading deeper into the cave system. My own prints, but made by someone who had walked this path before me. The tread pattern was identical to my current boots, and the stride length matched my gait exactly. "Follow them," the voices urged. "Complete the survey, document the acoustic properties, submit your report, do what you came here to do." I looked at my watch and felt reality shift around me like sand. According to the display, I had been in the cave for only 43 minutes, but my water supply suggested several hours had passed. My recorder showed 12 hours of audio data, though the timestamp indicated I had been recording for less than an hour. Time was becoming unreliable in Whispering Hollow, flowing at different rates in different parts of the chamber. Past and future were bleeding together, creating a temporal loop where all possible outcomes existed simultaneously. I was the 18th Nathan to enter this space, but I was also the first. I would escape successfully, and I would become part of the cave's permanent collection of voices. The boot prints led toward a passage I hadn't noticed before, its entrance hidden behind a natural stone formation. My mapping equipment registered it as a significant geological feature requiring detailed documentation. Professional protocol demanded investigation. As I approached the passage, the voices began to fade, replaced by something far more disturbing. Silence. Complete. Absolute silence that pressed against my consciousness like a physical weight. Not even the sound of my own breathing penetrated the acoustic void. Then, from somewhere ahead in the darkness, I heard my own voice calling back to me. "Testing," it said, exactly as I had called out an hour, or a day, or a lifetime earlier. And I realized, with a clarity that cut through all rationalization and doubt, that I was about to answer. Story 3. The fluorescent lights above my head buzzed like dying insects, casting their sickly white glow across the cramped radio station. 3:17 a.m. The witching hour, as my grandmother used to call it, though she never had to spend it alone in a concrete box surrounded by miles of empty desert highway. I adjusted my headphones and glanced at the ancient analog clock whose second hand jerked forward in stuttering increments, each tick echoing through the silence like a countdown to something I couldn't name. My name is Kevin Marsh, and for the past 6 years, I've been the overnight operator at KDS 104.7 FM, a small-time station that serves truckers, insomniacs, and the occasionally lost traveler making their way through the Nevada wasteland. The pay isn't much, but the solitude suits me. Or at least it used to. The interference started 3 weeks ago. At first I thought it was atmospheric. Solar flares maybe, or some military exercise bleeding into our frequency. Radio waves can be temperamental creatures, especially out here where the ionosphere plays tricks and phantom signals bounce across the desert like mirages. But this wasn't random static or distant AM bleeding through. This was deliberate, organized, impossible. It always began the same way, a low hum that would creep into whatever music I was playing, growing stronger until it drowned out everything else. Then came the voice, smooth, professional, with the practiced cadence of a seasoned broadcaster. The voice that made my skin crawl because I recognized it immediately, even though recognition was impossible. It was my voice. Not similar. Not close. It was me. Speaking words I'd never said. Conducting a radio show I'd never hosted. The Phantom Kevin introduced himself as the host of After Midnight Confessions, a call-in program where listeners shared their darkest experiences. But these weren't stories about past traumas or guilty secrets. These callers spoke about events that hadn't happened yet, tragedies, accidents, and losses that existed only in some twisted future tense. Tonight, the interference started at exactly 3:21 a.m., just as it had every night for the past week. The song I'd been playing, some forgotten 80s rock ballad, dissolved into that familiar electronic hum. I reached for the broadcast controls, fingers hovering over switches that had stopped responding to my commands days ago. The phantom signal muscled its way through our frequency, like an unwelcome guest settling into someone else's home. "Good evening, night owls," my doppelganger's voice purred through the speakers. "Welcome back to After Midnight Confessions, the show where tomorrow's sorrows find their voice today." I pressed my palms against my ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside my skull rather than the speakers. The headphones around my neck had gone silent, yet somehow the phantom program continued to fill the studio with its impossible broadcast. "We have some compelling calls lined up tonight," my other self continued. "Maria from Phoenix will be sharing her experience of next Tuesday's traffic incident on Interstate 10. Then we'll hear from Robert in Chicago, who has some fascinating insights about the elevator malfunction he'll experience next month at his office building." My hands trembled as I reached for the power switches. One by one, I killed every piece of equipment in the studio. The transmitter, the mixing board, the backup generators. The fluorescent lights died, plunging the room into absolute darkness. But the voice continued, now seeming to emanate from the very walls themselves. "Tonight's first caller is Maria. Maria, you're on the air." A woman's voice joined the phantom broadcast, shaky and filled with the kind of grief that comes from reliving trauma. She described in horrifying detail the collision that would claim her husband 3 days from now. The exact time, the license plate number of the other vehicle, the specific intersection where brake lights would fail to prevent the inevitable. She spoke with the broken certainty of someone who had already lived through the loss, even though the calendar on my desk insisted the date was still days away. I stumbled through the darkness toward the door, my hands groping along the walls like a blind man in a maze. The emergency exit sign glowed red above the threshold, its battery-powered light the only illumination in the room. But even as I reached for the handle, I hesitated. Something told me that leaving wouldn't stop the broadcast. The phantom program had transcended the physical boundaries of the radio station weeks ago. "Thank you for sharing, Maria," my voice said with professional sympathy that I'd never felt. "I know how difficult it must be to process something that hasn't quite crystallized into reality yet. But that's what we're here for, to help people cope with the inevitable before it becomes undeniable." I yanked open the door and stumbled into the hallway, but the voice followed me like a persistent shadow. The building's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, turning familiar corridors into something from a fever dream. My footsteps echoed against concrete walls as I made my way toward the parking lot, but each step seemed to take me further from escape rather than closer to freedom. "Our next caller is James from Denver," the Phantom Kevin announced as I pushed through the outer doors into the desert night. "James, I understand you have some concerns about the fire that will consume your apartment complex next week." The cool air hit my face like a slap, but it brought no relief. Above me, the stars seemed to pulse in rhythm with the phantom broadcast, as if the entire universe had become a radio receiver tuned to this impossible frequency. My pickup truck sat in the parking lot exactly where I'd left it 6 hours ago, but something about it looked wrong. Too angular in the red glow of the exit signs, too much like a metal coffin waiting for its occupant. I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever was happening inside that building. The engine coughed to life, and I switched on the radio, hoping to find proof that this was all some elaborate prank or technical malfunction. Instead, my own voice greeted me from the speakers. "James, you mentioned that the fire starts in apartment 3B. Can you tell our listeners more about how the electrical system fails?" I punched the preset buttons, scanning through every station in range. FM, AM, even the emergency broadcast frequency. Every channel carried the same impossible program. My phantom self conducted interviews with the future damned, collecting testimonies about events that existed only in the realm of possibility. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness as I pulled onto the empty highway, but even at 60 miles per hour, I couldn't outrun the broadcast. Every radio in the world seemed to be tuned to the same frequency, broadcasting the same impossible show. I drove for 20 minutes, then 30, passing nothing but empty desert and the occasional distant ranch light. But no matter how far I traveled, the Phantom Kevin's voice remained as clear as if I were sitting in the studio control room. "That's fascinating, James. And you're certain the smoke alarms will malfunction due to that specific wiring issue?" I pulled over at a truck stop that I'd visited hundreds of times before, its neon signs flickering like dying stars against the black sky. The parking lot was empty except for a single 18-wheeler whose driver was probably catching a few hours of sleep in the cab. I stumbled into the convenience store, hoping to find a radio that wasn't tuned to my personal nightmare. The clerk, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, glanced up from her magazine as I approached the counter. Behind her, a small transistor radio played soft country music, real music, not the phantom program that had been haunting me for weeks. For a moment, I felt a surge of relief. Maybe the broadcast was localized to the radio station. Maybe I was finally free. "Excuse me," I said, my voice hoarse from hours of silent terror. "Could you change the station on your radio?" She looked confused but reached for the tuning dial. As her fingers made contact with the controls, the country music faded into static, then resolved into that familiar, impossible voice. "Welcome back to After Midnight Confessions. I'm your host, and we're speaking tonight with callers who've experienced tomorrow's tragedies today." The clerk frowned and turned the dial again, but every station carried the same program. She looked at me with a mixture of confusion and concern, probably wondering why I'd gone pale at the sound of a simple radio show. "That's weird," she said, continuing to scan the frequencies. "Must be some kind of emergency broadcast test or something." But I could see in her eyes that she didn't really hear what I was hearing. To her, it was probably just another late-night talk show, unremarkable in its ordinariness. The Phantom Kevin was speaking only to me, broadcasting directly into my consciousness through some mechanism that transcended traditional radio waves. I mumbled an apology and stumbled back to my truck, the convenience store's fluorescent lights seeming to flicker in rhythm with my racing heartbeat. The Phantom program continued its impossible interviews as I drove back toward the station, each caller sharing detailed prophecies about personal disasters that wouldn't occur for days or weeks. A woman from Portland described the exact circumstances of her brother's motorcycle accident. A man from Atlanta provided specifics about the kitchen fire that would destroy his home next month. By the time I pulled back into the radio station parking lot, I had begun to wonder if I was losing my mind. The building looked exactly as I'd left it. A squat concrete structure that had housed caddies since 1987, unremarkable except for the tall transmission tower that pierced the desert sky like a metal needle. But something felt different about the place, as if it had shifted slightly in my absence, becoming a distorted version of itself. I walked back through the corridors that now seemed longer than they had been hours ago, past offices and storage rooms that I'd never noticed before. The phantom broadcast grew louder as I approached the studio, my doppelganger's voice echoing off the walls with supernatural clarity. "Our final caller tonight has a particularly unique perspective," the phantom Kevin was saying as I pushed open the studio door. "He's calling from very close to home." The studio looked exactly as I'd left it, equipment powered down, emergency lighting casting everything in red shadows. But somehow, the speakers were active again, broadcasting the impossible program despite having no electrical power. I stood in the doorway, paralyzed by the implications of what I was experiencing. "This caller has been listening to our show for several weeks now," my other self continued. "He's developed quite an attachment to our program, though I don't think he fully understands his role in tonight's broadcast." A chill ran down my spine as I realized the phantom Kevin was talking about me. But if I was the subject of discussion, then who was the caller? Who would provide details about my own future tragedy? "Let's welcome our next guest," the phantom Kevin said, and I could hear the smile in his voice, my voice, speaking words I'd never chosen. "He's calling in from the main studio right now." The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the dead equipment that somehow continued to broadcast its impossible signal. Then, cutting through the silence like a blade through flesh, came the sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The phone on my desk started to ring. Not the station's main line, which was connected to the switchboard in the front office. This was the direct line, the emergency number that only management knew, the phone that hadn't rung in over 2 years. The old rotary telephone sat on the corner of my desk like a black spider, its shrill bell cutting through the red-lit silence with mechanical persistence. "Go ahead," the phantom Kevin encouraged from the speakers. "Answer the phone. Our audience is very eager to hear what you have to say about your upcoming experience." My feet moved without conscious direction, carrying me across the studio floor toward the ringing phone. Each step felt like walking through quicksand, time stretching and distorting until the simple act of crossing the room seemed to take hours. The phone continued its relentless ringing, each tone more insistent than the last. I reached for the handset with a trembling hand, then stopped. Whatever was on the other end of that line, whatever voice would speak through the receiver, I knew it would shatter what remained of my sanity. But the alternative, leaving the phone to ring forever in the red-lit darkness, seemed even worse. "Don't keep us waiting," my phantom self said with gentle patience. "After all, you're the one who called." The phone's weight felt wrong in my hand as I lifted it to my ear, the plastic cold against my skin despite the desert heat that usually permeated the building. For a moment, there was only silence on the line. Not the absence of sound, but something deeper, a void that seemed to swallow noise itself. Then, cutting through the silence like a voice from the grave, I heard myself speak. "Hello," said the voice on the phone, identical to mine in every way except for the hollow quality that suggested it came from somewhere very far away. "I'm calling about the broadcast that will end everything." I tried to speak, to respond, to hang up, but my body had become a frozen observer to its own nightmare. The voice on the phone continued, describing in clinical detail the exact moment when the phantom program would achieve its final goal, not next week or next month, but in the next few minutes. It spoke about the precise time when the last barrier between the broadcast reality and physical reality would collapse, when the phantom Kevin would stop being a voice in the speakers and become something much more tangible. "It happens at exactly 4:15 a.m., my own voice explained through the phone with the matter-of-fact tone of a weather report. "That's when the station's reality becomes flexible enough to accommodate both versions of Kevin Marsh. The original will find that he's become something of a guest in his own life. I looked at the clock on the wall. 4:13 a.m. The phantom Kevin in the speakers laughed, a sound I'd never made, expressing an emotion I'd never felt. Thank you for that insightful preview. I think our listening audience has a much better understanding now of how tonight's transition will unfold. The phone line went dead, leaving only the dial tone buzzing in my ear like an electronic insect. But the phantom broadcast continued, my doppelganger now addressing me directly through the speakers. Kevin, he said, and the intimacy of hearing my own voice speak my name was more terrifying than any scream. I know you're listening. I know you're frightened. But you have to understand, this isn't an invasion. This is a homecoming. 4:14 a.m. The red emergency lighting began to flicker, casting shifting shadows across the studio equipment. But in those brief moments of darkness between flickers, I caught glimpses of something else, another version of the studio, where the equipment was powered on, and a figure sat at the microphone, conducting his impossible broadcast to an audience of the future damned. You see, Kevin, the phantom voice continued, you've been broadcasting on borrowed time for years now. Every night shift, every lonely hour you've spent in the station, you've been slowly fading from your own frequency. Tonight, we're simply correcting the signal. The fluorescent lights suddenly blazed to life, flooding the studio with harsh white light. But instead of the familiar control room I'd worked in for 6 years, I found myself looking at a mirror image, the same layout, the same equipment, but everything reversed, as if I were seeing the studio through some cosmic reflection. And there, sitting at the microphone with professional ease, was myself. He looked exactly like me, down to the same worn flannel shirt and the same 5 o'clock shadow. But his eyes held a confidence I'd never possessed, a certainty that spoke of someone who understood his purpose in the world. He smiled at me, not with malice, but with the patient kindness of someone welcoming a confused traveler home. Hello, Kevin, he said, and this time the words came from both the speakers and his lips simultaneously. Welcome to the real broadcast. I tried to move, to speak, to run, but found that I had become something less substantial than before, a signal slowly losing strength. The phantom Kevin, or perhaps the real Kevin, continued his introduction to the listening audience that existed somewhere in the space between radio waves and reality. For those just joining us, he said, we're experiencing a very special transition tonight. Our regular programming will continue as scheduled, but with a few personnel changes that our longtime listeners have been anticipating. The clock showed 4:15 a.m. exactly, and I felt something fundamental shift in the nature of my existence. I was still present in the studio, still aware of my surroundings, but I had become something more like an echo than a person, a phantom signal bouncing around in the space between frequencies. The other Kevin, the confident Kevin, the Kevin who belonged in this reality, opened the microphone for the next caller. Let's go to David from Sacramento. David, you're on the air. A man's voice filled the studio, describing in precise detail the circumstances that would lead to his disappearance next Thursday night, the exact time he would vanish from his own life, and find himself broadcasting from somewhere between the radio waves and the void. I understood then that I had become part of the phantom program, another voice in the chorus of the future damned. But the most terrifying realization was that I couldn't remember when I had first called in to share my own story, when I had described the exact circumstances of my own transition from broadcast operator to phantom signal. Had I always been the caller describing Kevin Marsh's displacement? Had I been broadcasting my own inevitable fate for weeks, creating the very program that would consume me? The other Kevin smiled at me from behind the microphone, and I saw in his expression a familiarity that suggested we had known each other far longer than this single night. Perhaps we were the same person, separated only by the thin membrane between what was real and what was broadcast. Perhaps every person was both the phantom and the original, existing simultaneously on multiple frequencies until something forced them to choose a single reality. Don't worry, he said, though whether he was speaking to me or to the listening audience I couldn't tell. The show must go on. Outside the studio windows, Dawn was still hours away, and the phantom broadcast would continue until the sun rose over the desert. But I no longer feared the voices of the future damned, or questioned the reality of the impossible program. I had become part of it, another signal in the eternal broadcast that existed in the space between what was and what would be. And somewhere, in another frequency just slightly out of phase with this one, another Kevin Marsh was probably sitting in another radio station, hearing his own voice conducting impossible interviews and wondering if he was losing his mind. The phone on the desk began to ring again, and I knew that when he answered it, he would hear my voice explaining the exact circumstances of his own transition. The cycle would continue, as it always had, as it always would. One phantom signal replacing another in the endless broadcast that connected all possible versions of reality. After midnight, anything was possible. Even the impossible was just another frequency waiting to be discovered. Story 4. The blueprints were wrong. I'd been staring at them for 20 minutes, cross-referencing measurements with my laser finder, when the discrepancy hit me like a physical blow. 42 years in building inspection had taught me to trust documents, but the numbers didn't lie. This third floor was 8 feet longer than it should have been. The Meridian building squatted on Elm Street like a wounded animal, its brick facade crumbling at the corners where ivy had worked its fingers into the mortar. Built in 1923, it had served as everything from a hotel to government offices before sitting empty for the past decade. Now some developer wanted to convert it into luxury condos, which meant I had to certify that the structure wouldn't collapse on the future tenants. I folded the blueprints and tucked them under my arm, their edges soft with age and handling. The elevator hadn't worked since the Carter administration, so I took the stairs, each step echoing in the hollow stairwell like gunshots. The building felt wrong. Not just structurally, but in some fundamental way that made my skin crawl. It was too quiet, too empty, as if the air itself had been holding its breath for years. The third-floor hallway stretched before me, lit by harsh fluorescent tubes that hummed with electrical tension. Half the bulbs had burned out, creating pools of shadow between islands of sickly light. I counted doorways as I walked, comparing them to the blueprint in my head. Administrative offices lined both sides, 12 doors total according to the plans. But I counted 13. The extra door sat at the end of the hallway, unremarkable except for its presence. Dark wood, brass handle tarnished with age, no nameplate or number. It looked identical to every other door in the building, which made its absence from the blueprints all the more unsettling. I approached slowly, my footsteps muffled by threadbare carpet that probably hadn't been cleaned since the Reagan years. The door seemed to shimmer slightly in my peripheral vision, though when I looked directly at it, it appeared solid and ordinary. The brass handle felt warm under my palm, not just room temperature warm, but body heat warm, as if someone had been gripping it moments before. The sensation sent a chill down my spine, but I turned the handle anyway. The door opened with a soft click that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Beyond the threshold lay a corridor. This was impossible. According to every blueprint, survey, and measurement I'd taken, this door should have opened onto the building's exterior wall. Instead, I found myself looking down a narrow hallway that stretched into darkness, its length extending far beyond what the building's footprint could accommodate. The walls were covered in the same peeling wallpaper as the rest of the building, but the pattern seemed different, the roses slightly larger, their thorns more pronounced. I stepped inside. The air tasted metallic, like copper pennies left too long in the sun. My flashlight beam revealed a corridor that defied every law of physics I understood. It had to be at least 60 feet long, maybe more, disappearing into shadows that seemed to swallow light itself. Doors lined both sides at regular intervals, each identical to the one I'd just passed through. My radio crackled to static when I tried to call my office. The sound made me jump, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. I was alone in here, wherever here was. The first door on my left opened onto what appeared to be the same third-floor hallway I'd just left, but something was off. The fluorescent lights all worked here, casting everything in harsh clinical brightness. The carpet looked new, its pattern crisp and unworn. When I checked my watch, the time had somehow jumped backward by 17 minutes. I backed out quickly, my breathing shallow and rapid. The corridor stretched before me, unchanged, patient, waiting. The second door revealed another version of the hallway, this one darker, mustier. The wallpaper here was different, green instead of blue, with a pattern of vines rather than geometric shapes. When I looked closer, I could swear the vines were moving, growing slowly across the walls like living things. Each door I opened showed me variations of the same space, subtle differences that accumulated like layers of sediment. In one, all the office doors stood open, revealing empty rooms filled with shadows. In another, the windows at the end of the hall showed not the street outside, but an endless expanse of gray sky. One version had no doors at all, just smooth walls that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. I lost track of time. My watch had stopped working, the hands frozen at 3:17, though I couldn't remember what time I'd entered the building. The corridor began to feel like home, its stale air and dim lighting as familiar as my own apartment. I'd filled half a notebook with observations, sketches, measurements that made no sense but felt important to record. That's when I heard the footsteps. They came from behind me, measured and deliberate, the sound of dress shoes on carpet, approaching at a steady pace. I turned, my flashlight beam wavering in my unsteady grip. The man walking toward me wore a familiar face. He looked exactly like me, same graying hair, same weathered hands, same inspector's badge hanging from his shirt pocket. But his eyes held a wildness that I didn't recognize, a desperate hunger that made my stomach clench with fear. "You found it too," he said, his voice identical to mine but carrying an edge of madness. "The door that doesn't belong." I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the carpet. This couldn't be happening. Hallucinations were a symptom of carbon monoxide poisoning, weren't they? Or severe stress. I'd been working too many hours, drinking too much coffee, not getting enough sleep. "How long have you been here?" I managed to ask. He laughed, the sound bitter and hollow. "Time doesn't work the same way in here. Could be hours, could be years. I've stopped counting the doors, stopped trying to map the variations. They're infinite, you know. Every choice you never made, every path you didn't take, they're all here, behind these doors. That's impossible. Is it?" He gestured to the corridor around us. "None of this should exist, but here we are. I've met others, you know, other versions of myself. One had never become an inspector. He was a teacher instead. Another had moved to California, married a woman named Sarah. They're all looking for the same thing. Which is? The original door. The first one. The one that started all this." His eyes gleamed in the flashlight beam. "It's here somewhere, in one of these infinite variations. The door that leads back to the beginning, before the choices, before the splits, before we got lost in all these possibilities." I backed away from him, my skin crawling with the impossibility of it all. This had to be a breakdown, some kind of psychotic episode brought on by stress and isolation. People didn't split into multiple versions of themselves. Buildings didn't contain impossible corridors that defied physics. "You don't believe me," he said, reading my expression. "That's fine. I didn't believe it either at first. But you'll see. You'll keep walking these halls, opening these doors, and eventually you'll understand. We're all trapped here now. All the versions of ourselves that were curious enough to walk through that first door." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows at the far end of the corridor. I stood there for a long moment, my breath coming in short gasps, before turning to flee the way I'd come. But the door I'd entered through was gone. The corridor stretched in both directions now, identical and endless. Every door I opened revealed another variation, another possibility, another version of the same impossible space. I tried to retrace my steps, to find some landmark or reference point, but everything looked the same while being subtly different. Hours passed, or maybe days. My watch remained frozen, my radio silent. I found more versions of myself, Some calm, some frantic, some who barely looked up when I passed. All of us searching, all of us lost in this maze of possibilities. In one room, I found a version of the inspector's office, where I'd started my career. My younger self sat at the desk, filling out forms with careful precision. He looked up when I entered, smiled, and went back to his work as if my presence was perfectly normal. In another, I discovered a version of my childhood home, complete with my parents sitting at the kitchen table playing cards. They greeted me warmly, offered me coffee, and acted as if I'd never left. When I tried to explain where I was, what had happened, they just smiled and nodded and dealt another hand. The worst was finding a version of myself that had given up entirely. He sat in the corner of an empty room, rocking back and forth, muttering about doors and choices and the weight of infinite possibility. His eyes were vacant, lost somewhere in the maze of his own mind. "Don't become me," he whispered when I tried to speak to him. "Don't stop looking. The original door is out there. It has to be." I left him there and kept walking. The corridor began to change as I traveled deeper into whatever this place was. The wallpaper shifted from roses to vines to geometric patterns and back again. Sometimes the ceiling was higher, sometimes lower. Once, I found a section where the floor was made of glass, revealing an impossible view of the night sky below my feet. I started leaving marks on the walls, scratches with my keys, chalk lines with a stub I found in my pocket. But when I returned to the same spots later, the marks were gone, or different, or accompanied by marks I hadn't made. Someone else's attempts at navigation, perhaps, or evidence that even my own actions were splitting into variations. The notebook I'd been keeping filled up, then emptied itself, then filled again with handwriting that looked like mine but contained observations I didn't remember making. Notes about doors that led to childhood bedrooms, about hallways that smelled like my grandmother's perfume, about versions of myself that had made different choices at crucial moments. I found a door that opened onto my wedding day, the one that never happened because Sarah moved away. I found another that showed me graduating from college with an engineering degree instead of dropping out to support my sick mother. Each possibility was perfect in its detail, complete in its reality, and utterly wrong in its existence. The hunger grew in me then, the same desperate need I'd seen in the first version of myself I'd encountered. I needed to find the original door, the one that would take me back to where this all started, back to a single timeline, a single choice, a single self. I opened door after door, corridor after corridor, until my feet bled in my shoes and my throat was raw from calling out to the other versions of myself I sometimes glimpsed in the distance. We were all here, all the choices I'd made and unmade, all the paths taken and untaken. And still I walk these halls, opening doors, searching for the beginning. My watch reads 3:17, forever 3:17, the moment I first turned that warm brass handle and stepped into impossibility. Sometimes I wonder if I ever really left the third floor of the Meridian building, if I'm still standing there in that flickering fluorescent light, staring at blueprints that don't match reality, my mind broken by the weight of discovering something that shouldn't exist. But then I see another door, feel another warm handle, and I know I have to keep looking, because somewhere in this infinite maze of possibilities lies the truth, the original door that started it all. And maybe, if I'm lucky, the way home. The corridor stretches before me, patient and eternal, filled with the echoes of my own footsteps and the whispered promises of doors that lead everywhere and nowhere. I reach for the next handle. It's warm. Story 5. The Blackwood mansion squatted against the October sky like a tumor, its Victorian gingerbread trim rotting at the edges. I'd seen plenty of old houses in my 23 years installing windows, but this one felt different, wrong somehow. The shadows between its towers seemed too deep, and the windows, God, the windows. Even from the street, they looked like dead eyes staring back at me. I shouldered my toolbox and approached the front door, my breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air. Mrs. Caldwell, the elderly owner, had hired me to replace several windows on the second floor. Simple job, she'd said. The originals were warped beyond repair. letting in drafts that made the house impossible to heat. What she hadn't mentioned was how the blueprints she'd given me didn't match what I was seeing. The front door's brass knocker was green with age, shaped like a gargoyle's head with hollow eye sockets that seemed to track my movement. Mrs. Caldwell answered before I could use it, as if she'd been watching from behind the heavy curtains. "Mr. Henley," she said, her voice thin as paper, "thank you for coming so early." She was smaller than I remembered from our initial meeting, almost fragile in her wool cardigan and thick stockings. Her hands shook slightly as she gestured me inside, though whether from age or something else I couldn't tell. The interior hit me like a physical weight. The air was thick and stale, carrying scents of old wood, dust, and something underneath, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. Heavy burgundy drapes blocked most of the natural light, leaving the hallways in perpetual twilight. Family portraits lined the walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to follow me as Mrs. Caldwell led me toward the main staircase. "The windows are on the second floor," she said, not looking back. "Third door on the right, fourth on the left, and the corner room at the end of the hall. I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything." Her footsteps faded quickly, leaving me alone with the house's settling groans and the tick of an unseen grandfather clock. I climbed the stairs, each step producing a creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. The banister was smooth under my palm, worn by decades of hands. The second-floor hallway stretched longer than it should have, given the house's exterior dimensions. Gas sconces lined the walls, their frosted glass shades casting weak yellow light that barely penetrated the gloom. I counted the doors as I walked, first, second, third on the right. I stopped, checking the blueprint Mrs. Caldwell had provided. According to the drawing, this should be a bedroom facing the east garden. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was wrong. Not wrong in any way I could immediately articulate, but wrong nonetheless. The dimensions felt off. Too long, too narrow, as if someone had stretched the space like taffy. The window at the far end should have overlooked the garden, but through the glass I saw something else entirely. I saw a library. Not just any library, but one that couldn't possibly exist within the house's structure. Tall shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with leather-bound volumes. A fire crackled in a marble fireplace, casting dancing shadows across Persian rugs. And there, sitting in a high-backed chair with his back to me, was a man in a dark suit reading a newspaper. I blinked hard, shook my head, and looked again. The library remained, solid and real as the floor beneath my feet. The man turned a page of his newspaper with deliberate care, never acknowledging my presence. My mouth had gone dry. I approached the window slowly, my footsteps muffled by a dusty carpet that smelled of mothballs. The glass was cold against my fingertips, real enough, but beyond it lay an impossible space. I could see details with crystal clarity, the grain of the wooden shelves, the gold lettering on book spines, even the ember glow reflecting off the reader's spectacles. I pressed my palm flat against the glass. The man in the chair stiffened, his newspaper rustling. He turned his head slightly, as if listening for something. For a moment, I thought he might look directly at me, but he simply returned to his reading. The blueprint crinkled in my other hand as I double-checked the measurements. This window should face east, toward Mrs. Caldwell's rose garden. I moved to the actual east wall and found it solid, papered in faded blue roses. No window, no library, just plaster and wallpaper that felt reassuringly normal under my touch. I spent the next hour taking measurements and notes, trying to focus on the work, but my eyes kept drifting back to that impossible window. The man had finished his newspaper and was now browsing the shelves, running his finger along book spines with the casual familiarity of someone in his own study. Sometimes he would pull a volume free, flip through a few pages, then replace it with a dissatisfied shake of his head. The fourth door on the left revealed another anomaly. This window showed what appeared to be a grand ballroom, its polished floor reflecting the light from an enormous crystal chandelier. A woman in an elaborate Victorian gown waltzed alone across the empty space, her arms positioned as if holding an invisible partner. Her dress rustled with each turn, and I could swear I heard the faint strains of music, though that might have been my imagination. Like the library, the ballroom occupied space that shouldn't exist. The house's exterior wall ran directly behind where that vast room stretched into the distance. By the time I reached the corner room, my hands were trembling. The rational part of my mind insisted I was experiencing some kind of breakdown, stress, perhaps, or carbon monoxide poisoning from the old furnace. But the windows felt real. The scenes beyond them had a solidity that dreams lacked. The corner room's window was different from the others, larger, with an ornate frame carved with intertwining vines and strange symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly. Through this window, I saw not one room but several, overlapping like double-exposed photographs. A kitchen from the 1940s occupied the same space as a modern office, which in turn shared reality with what looked like a medieval chamber complete with rushes on the floor. Different time periods existing simultaneously in the same impossible space. In the kitchen, a woman in a floral house dress kneaded bread dough with methodical precision. In the office, a man in a business suit typed at a computer, his face illuminated by the screen's blue glow. In the medieval chamber, a figure in robes bent over a wooden table, grinding something with a mortar and pestle. None of them seemed aware of the others. I watched for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The scenes shifted and changed like channels on a television, sometimes showing the same spaces but in different eras. The kitchen became a 1920s speakeasy, then a Depression-era soup kitchen, then returned to its 1940s incarnation. The office transformed into a 1960s typing pool, then a 1980s computer lab, then back to modern day. The medieval chamber remained constant, unchanging, as if it existed outside of time entirely. It was there that I first noticed them watching me. The robed figure had stopped grinding and was staring directly at the window, directly at me. Their face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel the weight of their gaze like a physical pressure against my chest. They raised one hand and pressed it against their side of the glass, fingers splayed wide. I stumbled backward, knocking over my toolbox. Screwdrivers and measuring tapes clattered across the wooden floor, the sound impossibly loud in the silence. When I looked back at the window, the robed figure was gone. But in the kitchen scene, the woman had stopped kneading and was looking over her shoulder with an expression of desperate urgency. She saw me. She moved to her side of the window and began gesturing frantically, her mouth forming words I couldn't hear. Her movements were sharp, panicked, like someone trying to warn of imminent danger. She pointed behind me, then at herself, then at me again, her eyes wide with terror. I spun around, but the room behind me was empty. Just dusty furniture covered in white sheets, and the faint sound of Mrs. Caldwell moving around somewhere downstairs. When I turned back to the window, all the scenes had changed. Now I saw only darkness, as if someone had turned off all the lights in those impossible rooms. But in that darkness, shapes moved. Figures pressed against the glass from the other side, their faces pale and distorted. Some gestured wildly. Others simply stared with hollow eyes that reflected light from a source I couldn't identify. They were all trying to tell me something. I backed toward the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. The house suddenly felt suffocating, its walls pressing in from all sides. The sweet, cloying smell I'd noticed earlier was stronger here, almost overpowering. It reminded me of flowers left too long in water, of things slowly rotting. Mrs. Caldwell appeared in the doorway so suddenly I nearly cried out. "Finding everything all right, dear?" she asked, but her voice sounded different now. Hollow, like it was coming from a great distance. I tried to speak, to tell her about the windows, but my throat had closed up. She stepped into the room, moving with a fluid grace that seemed wrong for someone her age. Her eyes, which I remembered as pale blue, now appeared almost black in the dim light. "The windows are special," she said, as if reading my thoughts. "They've been in the house for generations. Some say they show what was, what is, and what might be. Others say they're just windows, and what you see through them depends entirely on who's looking." She moved closer, and I caught that sickly sweet scent again. Stronger now. It was coming from her. "What do you see, Mr. Henley?" I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Rooms that don't exist. people from different times. She nodded as if this was perfectly normal. And do they see you? I thought of the robed figure, the panicked woman in the kitchen, the pale faces pressed against the glass in the darkness. Yes. Then you should be very careful, Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice taking on a sing-song quality that made my skin crawl. Because once they know you're watching, they'll never stop trying to reach you. I pushed past her and stumbled into the hallway, my toolbox forgotten. But the hallway was different now, longer, with more doors than before. The gas sconces flickered as I passed, casting dancing shadows that seemed to follow me. From behind each door came sounds, whispered conversations, footsteps, the rustle of clothing, the scratch of pen on paper, all the sounds of life from the impossible rooms. I ran toward the stairs, but they seemed to stretch away from me like something from a nightmare. The portraits on the walls had changed too. Instead of stern-faced ancestors, they now showed the people I'd seen through the windows. The man from the library, the dancing woman, the bread-kneading housewife, all of them staring out of their frames with expressions of desperate warning. Finally, impossibly, I reached the main floor. The front door stood open, letting in blessed natural light and the smell of autumn leaves. I stumbled outside, gasping for air that didn't taste of decay and secrets. But even in the safety of the front yard, I could feel the windows watching me. I turned back to look at the house, counting the second-floor windows, trying to match them to the rooms I'd visited. There were too many. The house had more windows than rooms, more rooms than its structure could contain. They stared down at me like eyes, and behind each pane of glass I could see movement. Figures pressed against the windows from inside, some gesturing, others simply watching. And in the corner window, the one that showed multiple time periods, I saw something that made my blood freeze. It was me. An older version of myself. Hair gray, face lined with wrinkles, and something deeper. Something like terror that had worn permanent grooves. This older me was pressing both hands against the glass, mouth open in what looked like a scream. He was trying to tell me something, his movements frantic and desperate. Behind him, the overlapping rooms flickered and changed, but he remained constant, trapped in that impossible space, aging and warning and never being heard. I staggered backward, nearly falling over my own feet. The older me in the window was pointing now, not at me but past me, toward something behind me. His face was a mask of terror, his mouth forming a single word over and over. I couldn't read lips, but I knew what he was saying. Run. Mrs. Caldwell's voice drifted from somewhere inside the house, calling my name with that hollow, wrong inflection. The sound sent ice through my veins. I turned and walked quickly toward my truck, forcing myself not to run. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys. In the rearview mirror, I could see the Blackwood mansion squatting against the sky, its windows gleaming like black eyes in the afternoon sun. Even from the street, I could make out shapes moving behind the glass. I drove away without looking back, but I could feel those windows watching me until I rounded the corner, and the house disappeared from view. That was 3 months ago. I've tried to convince myself it was stress, exhaustion, maybe a gas leak that caused hallucinations. I've researched the Blackwood mansion's history, looking for logical explanations. The records are confusing, contradictory. The house has been sold dozens of times over the past century, always after short periods of ownership. Previous contractors have left jobs unfinished, often abandoning their tools and equipment. Mrs. Caldwell's phone number has been disconnected. According to the city records, no one named Caldwell has owned the property in over 40 years. But late at night, when I'm lying in bed staring at the ceiling, I think about that older version of myself trapped behind impossible glass. I think about how he looked, not just older, but worn down, as if he'd been trying to warn people for years, maybe decades. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch my reflection in my bathroom mirror and wonder if my hair looks a little grayer than it should, if my face seems a little more lined, if I'm getting closer to becoming the man I saw in that window, trapped forever in a room that doesn't exist, trying desperately to warn the next person who might make the mistake of looking through glass that shows more than it should. The windows in my own house feel different now. Sometimes I avoid looking out of them, especially at night, because I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, in some impossible room beyond the glass, there might be someone looking back. Story 6. The chlorine smell hits different at 2 a.m., sharper, more chemical, like it's trying to mask something it wasn't designed to hide. I've been working nights at the Riverside Aquatic Center for 3 years now, and the empty pool has always been my sanctuary. No screaming kids, no entitled soccer moms, no teenagers pretending to drown for attention. Just me, the gentle hum of the filtration system, and 8 lanes of crystal clear water reflecting the overhead fluorescence like a mirror to nowhere. Used to be peaceful. Used to be. The first time I noticed something off was 2 weeks ago. I was doing my usual rounds, checking chemical levels and skimming debris, when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. A dark shape gliding beneath the surface, too fluid to be floating trash, too purposeful to be a shadow cast by the lights. I told myself it was fatigue. 42 years old, pulling night shifts to supplement my day job at the hardware store. My eyes were bound to play tricks on me eventually. But when I aimed my flashlight at the water, the beam seemed to penetrate deeper than it should, illuminating depths that exceeded the pool's actual 8-foot maximum. And then the shape dove. Not sank, dove. With intention, with intelligence. The incident reports I filed were vague. Possible debris in pool requires further investigation. Management nodded, blamed the municipal storm drains, and told me to keep an eye out. They had no idea I'd started keeping both eyes out, along with a growing knot of anxiety that made my coffee taste like ash. Night after night I watched. The shapes, because there were multiple now, moved with increasing boldness. They undulated through the water like smoke given form, humanoid but wrong, their proportions shifting in ways that hurt to follow. Arms that stretched too long, torsos that compressed and expanded, heads that turned completely around while their bodies moved forward. I started bringing an underwater camera, one of those cheap waterproof disposables. Every photo came back showing nothing but empty water and distorted light patterns. But I knew what I'd seen. The way they moved wasn't random. It was coordinated, purposeful, like they were searching for something, or fishing for something. The first object appeared in the filtration system basket 3 days later, a coin, silver, and unfamiliar, with a date stamped clearly on its surface, 2047. I held it under the harsh utility room light, feeling its weight, its reality. The metal was cold in a way that seemed to leach warmth from my fingers, and when I set it on the workbench, it left a ring of condensation despite being completely dry. I should have thrown it away. Should have convinced myself it was some kid's prop coin from a science fiction movie. Instead, I pocketed it, and for the rest of my shift, it felt like carrying a piece of ice that never melted. The photographs started showing up 2 nights later. Polaroids, impossibly crisp and bright, depicting the very pool I guarded but populated with people I'd never seen. Men and women in swimwear from decades past. Their faces turned toward the camera with expressions of confused terror, as if they'd been caught in the middle of something they didn't understand. The timestamps in the corners showed dates spanning 60 years, but every photo had been taken in the exact same location, Lane 4, 3 feet from the deep end. I knew because I'd memorized every tile, every lane marker, every imperfection in the pool's surface. This was my domain, and these strangers were somehow occupying it in impossible moments frozen in Polaroid time. The worst part wasn't the photographs themselves. It was that I recognized the pool's configuration in each image, the positioning of the lifeguard chairs, the exact pattern of mineral stains on the deck, the specific way the emergency exit sign cast its reflection on the water. These weren't taken in some other pool that happened to look similar. They were taken here, in my pool, across decades when I knew for certain it had never existed. Construction records showed the Riverside Aquatic Center had been built in 1998. I'd verified that myself after finding the first photograph dated 1962. By the end of the second week, I'd collected 17 coins from impossible futures and 23 photographs of impossible pasts. The maintenance log I was required to keep became a catalog of denial. Unusual debris removed from filtration system. continuing to monitor water clarity. All systems functioning normally. Nothing was functioning normally. The shapes in the water grew bolder, surfacing just enough to create ripples that spread in perfect geometric patterns across the pool's surface. Not random waves, but deliberate designs, hexagons, spirals, concentric circles that formed and dissolved with mathematical precision. When I tried to photograph these patterns, my camera captured only ordinary water movement, but I watched them happen night after night with my own eyes. The smell changed too. Beneath the omnipresent chlorine, something else began to emerge. Salt water, which made no sense in a freshwater pool. But more than that, the organic scent of deep ocean, kelp and pressure and things that lived in darkness. It was faint at first, noticeable only when I leaned close to check chemical levels. Then it grew stronger, until some nights I felt like I was standing at the edge of an ocean rather than a municipal swimming pool. I started testing the water obsessively. pH levels, chlorine content, total alkalinity, everything came back normal. The lab reports were pristine, textbook perfect, as if the water was somehow sanitizing itself of whatever was living in it. Because something was living in it. The night I saw them emerge partially changed everything. I was reviewing my collection of impossible artifacts when movement caught my eye. The shapes weren't just gliding underwater anymore. They were breaking the surface, just barely, just enough to disturb the reflected lights and leave patterns of wetness on the deck. But the wet marks weren't random splashes. They were handprints. Dozens of them, appearing in sequence around the pool's perimeter, as if invisible swimmers were pulling themselves from the water. The prints evaporated as I watched, but not in the random way water normally disappears. They faded in perfect geometric progression, each handprint dissolving into the same hexagonal pattern I'd seen on the water's surface. The concrete absorbed the moisture in impossible designs, creating temporary mandalas that lasted exactly 47 seconds before vanishing completely. I timed them. 47 seconds. Every time. When I aimed my flashlight at the areas where the prints appeared, the beam seemed to bend, creating shadows where there should have been illumination. The shadows moved independently of my light source, stretching and contracting like living things responding to some stimulus I couldn't perceive. That's when I realized they weren't random movements. The shapes underwater, the emerging handprints, the geometric patterns, they were coordinated, purposeful. They were working together to accomplish something. They were fishing. The revelation hit me during my lunch break, sitting in my car with a thermos of coffee that had gone cold while I stared at the building's mundane exterior. Every night, the activity grew more intense, more focused. The shapes weren't exploring or playing or even hunting. They were excavating, pulling something up from depths that shouldn't exist, bringing it piece by piece to a surface that shouldn't accommodate it. I returned to my post with new eyes and a growing certainty that I was witnessing something that defied every rational explanation I could construct. The shapes moved with increased urgency now that I understood their purpose, diving deeper and emerging with something. I couldn't see what they carried, but the water displaced differently around them, as if they were hauling invisible cargo of immense weight. The filtration system began producing artifacts daily. More coins from years that hadn't happened yet, some marked with dates stretching into the next century. Photographs multiplied, showing the same pool, but with increasing crowds of confused faces, as if whatever was being pulled from the depths was attracting more witnesses across time. And then there were the maps, hand-drawn schematics of the pool and surrounding area, but depicting structures that didn't exist. Underground chambers extending beneath the building, vast caverns connected by tunnels that stretched for miles under the city. The maps were rendered in precise detail, complete with depth measurements and directional annotations, all written in languages I didn't recognize. But I could read the numbers. The depth measurements. According to these impossible blueprints, the pool I guarded extended downward for over 300 feet, connecting to a network of submerged passages that reached far beyond the building's foundation. I began measuring. 8 feet. The pool was 8 feet deep, exactly as it had always been. But when I dropped a weighted line into the center of Lane 4 at 3 a.m., With the shapes circling below like sharks sensing blood, the line continued falling. 20 feet, 50 feet, 100 feet before I ran out of rope and started hyperventilating. I pulled the line back up, hand over hand, feeling resistance as if I were dragging it through thick liquid rather than ordinary pool water. When the weight finally surfaced, it was covered in algae that didn't match any local species and carried traces of sand that felt wrong between my fingers. Too fine, too smooth, like it had been ground by pressures that existed only in deep ocean trenches. The weight of reality began shifting around me like sand in an hourglass. Everything I thought I knew about my workplace, my routine, my own perceptions became suspect. Was I losing my mind? Had years of chemical exposure finally taken their toll? Or was I witnessing something genuine and impossible that my rational mind simply couldn't process? The shapes gave me my answer on Thursday night. I was documenting my latest collection of artifacts when every light in the facility suddenly dimmed. Not a power failure. The illumination decreased gradually, as if something were absorbing the energy directly from the fixtures. The pool's surface became mirror black, reflecting nothing, showing only depths that seemed to extend beyond the reach of physics. And then they all surfaced at once. Dozens of humanoid forms breaking through the water simultaneously, creating waves that should have flooded the deck but somehow contained themselves within the pool's boundaries. They emerged just enough for me to see their true nature. Shadows given substance, darkness with purpose, shapes that existed in the spaces between light and matter. They were hauling something massive, something that rose from impossible depths with the slow inevitability of a submarine surfacing in deep ocean. The water displaced around it, creating whirlpools and currents that defied the pool's static nature. But the thing itself remained just beyond my perception, visible only as a disturbance in space, a presence too large for the container that somehow held it. I understood then what I was witnessing. Not a haunting or a hallucination, but an excavation. Something enormous and ancient was being retrieved from depths that existed parallel to our reality, brought piece by piece to a surface that served as a gateway between worlds. The coins, the photographs, the maps, they were evidence of previous attempts, other times and places where this same process had unfolded. The shapes worked with desperate efficiency, their movements coordinated by some intelligence I couldn't fathom. Whatever they were bringing up was nearly complete, nearly ready for what? Transit? Assembly? Awakening? As dawn approached and the first hints of sunlight began filtering through the facility's windows, the shapes retreated. The massive presence sank back into impossible depths, and the pool returned to its mundane 8-foot depth and chlorinated normalcy. But I knew it was temporary. Each night brought them closer to their goal, and soon they would finish their work. I sit here now, writing this account as my replacement arrives for the day shift, and I know I won't be returning tomorrow night. Not because I'm afraid of what I've seen, but because I've begun to understand my role in it. The photographs of confused swimmers across decades, they're not random documentation, they're recruitment, evidence of others who witnessed the excavation process and became part of it. Their images captured at the moment they realized what was being offered to them. The coins from future years aren't artifacts being retrieved from below, they're payment, compensation for services rendered by those who chose to help rather than flee. And the maps showing vast underground networks, they're not depicting what exists beneath the pool. They're showing what will exist once the excavation is complete and the barriers between depths are permanently dissolved. I can feel the silver coin in my pocket growing colder as I write these words, and I know that when tonight falls and the shapes return to continue their work, I won't be standing on the deck as an observer. I'll be joining them in the water, helping to bring up whatever wants so desperately to reach our surface. Because I've realized something that chills me more than any supernatural revelation. I want to help them. Despite every rational instinct screaming at me to run, to report what I've seen, to find another job in a place where pools stay exactly as deep as they're supposed to be. I want to see what they're bringing up. I want to be part of something larger than the mundane reality I've guarded for 3 years. The day shift supervisor waves at me through the glass office door, ready to begin his routine of pH testing and chemical adjustments in a pool that he'll perceive as perfectly normal. He'll never notice the geometric patterns the evaporating handprints leave behind, or feel the weight of impossible artifacts in the filtration system. But tonight, when the shapes return to continue their patient excavation, I'll be ready to trade my observer status for something more participatory. The coin in my pocket has grown warm now, responding to my decision with what feels like approval. I wonder what date they'll stamp on my photograph when they add it to their collection. I wonder if I'll still be wondering anything at all. Story 7. The static crackled through the ancient speakers like electricity through dead nerves. I'd been working at Wexham for 7 years, long enough to know every wheeze and groan of the vintage equipment, every pattern of interference that plagued our lonely corner of the AM dial. But this sound was different, deliberate, almost breathing. The station occupied the 3rd floor of a brick building that had seen better decades. My booth overlooked the empty parking lot where streetlights cast sickly yellow pools across cracked asphalt. At 2:17 a.m., I was the only soul awake for miles, riding the graveyard shift with nothing but late-night talk radio reruns and my own thoughts for company. The interference started during a commercial break. Between the spots for used cars and discount mattresses, something else bled through. A voice, distorted and thin, speaking words I couldn't quite catch. I adjusted the filters, checked the signal strength, but the meters showed nothing unusual. The voice faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me staring at the green oscilloscope display, wondering if I'd imagined it. Sleep deprivation played tricks on technicians. I'd learned that lesson early in my career, back when I still believed every strange signal meant something significant. But this felt different. The voice had carried an urgency that made my skin crawl, a familiarity that I couldn't place. 3 nights later, it happened again. This time, I was ready. My fingers hovered over the recording equipment as the static swelled during the 3 a.m. news break. The interference built slowly, like someone tuning through stations on an old radio, searching for the right frequency. Then, clear as daylight despite the poor signal quality, I heard my own name. Daniel, if you're listening to this, you need to pay attention to what I'm about to tell you. My hand froze halfway to the recording button. The voice was mine, not similar, not close, but absolutely, unmistakably my own voice speaking words I'd never said. The sound quality was terrible, buried under layers of static and distortion, but I'd spent enough time listening to audio to recognize vocal patterns, inflections, the particular way I rounded certain vowels. At 3:42 a.m., the old woman in apartment 6B will turn on her kitchen light. She'll make tea and sit at her window. You'll see her from your booth. The transmission cut to static. I stared at the clock. 3:38 a.m. 4 minutes. I looked out at the apartment building across the street, its windows dark except for a few scattered units where insomniacs and shift workers live their nocturnal lives. Apartment 6B faced my direction. 6th floor, 2nd window from the left. Dark as a dead eye. At exactly 3:42 a.m., the light came on. An elderly woman appeared at the window, visible in silhouette as she moved around her kitchen. She prepared something at the counter, tea presumably, then settled into a chair by the window, just as the voice had predicted. I sat back in my chair, heart hammering against my ribs. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe I'd noticed a pattern in the woman's behavior over the years of working night shifts. Maybe my subconscious had picked up on subtle cues and created the voice as a way of processing that information. Sleep deprivation could cause auditory hallucinations. Stress, isolation, the eerie atmosphere of the empty station, all factors that could contribute to a psychological break. But it had been my voice, my exact voice. The following week brought more transmissions, each one more detailed and disturbing than the last. They came at irregular intervals, sometimes during dead air, sometimes cutting through programming with an override that shouldn't have been possible with our equipment. The voice, my voice, provided updates on mundane events with unsettling precision. The coffee shop on Main Street will receive a delivery truck at 6:15 a.m. The driver will drop a case of milk, and the owner will come out to help clean it up. A police car will drive past the station at 4:27 a.m. The officer will slow down and look up at your window, but he won't stop. The fluorescent light in the hallway will flicker exactly 17 times between 2:30 and 2:45 a.m. Every prediction came true. I began recording the transmissions, filling a digital archive with evidence of my own voice predicting the future. During daylight hours, in the safety of my apartment, I analyzed the audio files with professional software. The vocal patterns matched my voice perfectly. Frequency analysis, spectral comparison, even the subtle speech impediment where I slightly softened certain consonants. But the audio quality suggested the recordings had been made with equipment far inferior to what we used at the station, as if they were coming from somewhere else entirely. The voice itself began to change over time. While it remained unmistakably mine, it carried an increasing sense of urgency, exhaustion, and fear. The predictions grew more personal, more specific to my own activities. You're going to doubt what you're hearing. You'll think you're losing your mind. But Daniel, you need to understand. This is real. We're real. All of us. The pronoun shift caught my attention immediately. Us. We. The voice had stopped speaking as an individual and started referring to a group. That night, I received the first overlapping transmission. Two versions of my voice spoke simultaneously, their words creating a disorienting echo effect as they delivered the same message at slightly different speeds. The audio equipment strained to process the dual signals, and the speakers began to emit a low hum that I felt in my bones rather than heard with my ears. The pattern is accelerating, both voices said, their timing gradually synchronizing until they spoke in perfect unison. The equipment can't handle much more. You need to listen carefully to what comes next. Over the following nights, the transmissions multiplied. 3 voices, then 5. Then so many overlapping versions of myself that individual words became impossible to distinguish. They spoke over each other in a cacophony of urgent warnings, their messages fragmenting into incomprehensible noise. The old AM equipment groaned under the strain, transforming the normally cool booth into a sweltering cave filled with the smell of overheating electronics and burnt dust. I installed additional recording equipment, thermal monitors, anything that might help me understand what was happening. The temperature readings showed the equipment operating within normal parameters, but the metal housing of the transmitters became too hot to touch. The electromagnetic field detectors I borrowed from a friend who investigated paranormal phenomena went haywire, their needles dancing wildly across scales that supposedly measured otherworldly activity. The overlapping voices began to form patterns. Beneath the chaos, I could make out fragments of coherent messages. Tried to prevent. Same result every time. Can't break the loop. They're already here. Watch the windows. Don't let them see. Sleep became impossible. Even when I left the station, the voices followed me home, bleeding through my television, my radio, even the white noise of my air conditioner. Every electronic device seemed to carry traces of the transmissions, as if the signals had infected the very electromagnetic spectrum around me. I began to research temporal physics, quantum mechanics, anything that might explain how multiple versions of myself could be communicating across time. The scientific literature offered theories about parallel dimensions, temporal loops, and quantum entanglement, but nothing that could account for the specific nature of my experience. The voices weren't just predicting the future, they were describing attempts to change it, each iteration leading to the same inevitable outcome. During one particularly intense session, when at least a dozen versions of my voice spoke simultaneously, I managed to isolate individual words using audio editing software. The message, when pieced together, was chilling. Every time we try to warn you, another timeline splits off. Every timeline leads to the same moment. They've been waiting for us to figure it out. They've been waiting for the transmissions to reach critical mass. The pronoun had shifted again. Not you, but us. As if the voice recognized that I was becoming part of the same group. Another iteration caught in the same pattern. I noticed movement in the windows across the street. It started subtly. Shadows that didn't match the movements of the people inside. Silhouettes that appeared in empty rooms. At first, I attributed it to fatigue and stress. My eyes were strained from staring at audio equipment for hours, my mind frayed from lack of sleep and the constant barrage of impossible voices. But the movements became more obvious, more deliberate. Figures appeared at windows where no apartments existed, standing motionless in spaces that should have been structural walls or utility rooms. They watched the station with an attention that felt physical, a weight of observation that made my skin crawl even when I couldn't see them directly. The voices confirmed my growing paranoia. They're gathering. Each transmission brings them closer. We've been feeding them information, Daniel. Every timeline we create gives them more access. I realized with growing horror that my attempts to understand the transmissions had been playing into something larger. The recordings, the analysis, the obsessive documentation. I was creating a feedback loop, generating the very data that some unknown presence was using to monitor and manipulate the timeline. The equipment began to malfunction in ways that defied explanation. Audio cables rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking. Settings changed on controls I hadn't touched. The booth's temperature fluctuated wildly, creating condensation that formed strange patterns on the windows, patterns that looked almost like writing in a language I couldn't read. On the night everything escalated beyond any hope of return to normalcy, the transmissions achieved perfect synchronization. Every version of my voice spoke the same words at exactly the same time, creating a sound that was both singular and infinitely deep, as if spoken by one person across countless dimensions. Daniel, you need to understand. This moment, right now, listening to this transmission, this is the event we've been trying to prevent. This is where it all begins. The realization hit me like ice water in my veins. I wasn't receiving warnings from the future. I was creating them. Every transmission I recorded, every analysis I performed, every desperate attempt to understand what was happening was generating the very timeline loop that trapped all versions of myself. The voices continued, urgent and overlapping again as the synchronization broke down. Don't make the recording. Don't analyze the patterns. Don't look at the windows. Don't become aware. But it was too late. I was already aware. The knowledge couldn't be unknown. The pattern couldn't be broken. As I sat in the overheated booth, surrounded by malfunctioning equipment and watched by presences that existed in the spaces between moments, I understood that I had become the first link in an infinite chain. My hand moved toward the recording equipment, not by choice but by inevitability. I would document this moment, analyze it, try to understand it, and in doing so, I would create the transmission that would reach another version of myself in another timeline. That Daniel would receive the warning, investigate the phenomenon, and eventually arrive at this same moment of terrible clarity. The figures in the windows were no longer hiding. They stood openly now, featureless silhouettes that existed in impossible spaces, watching as another iteration of their carefully orchestrated loop reached its conclusion. I pressed the record button. The static crackled through the ancient speakers like electricity through dead nerves, and somewhere in the distance, another Daniel began his descent into the same labyrinth of temporal impossibility. The voices whispered their warnings across time, each one carrying the desperate hope that somehow, some version of me would find a way to break the pattern. But hope, I was beginning to understand, was just another word for the fuel that kept the loop spinning. In the windows across the street, the watchers smiled with faces they didn't have, and the transmission began again. Story 8. The first time my GPS spoke a street name that didn't exist, I thought I'd misheard. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of night when the city feels hollow, when even the traffic lights seem to hesitate before changing. I'd been driving for UberX for 3 years, working the graveyard shift because the money was better, and because sleep had become something I negotiated with rather than embraced. The last passenger, a quiet woman heading home from a late shift at the hospital, had climbed out at Mercy General 20 minutes ago, and I was cruising through downtown looking for the next ping. That's when she spoke. The voice was the same synthesized female tone I'd grown accustomed to, the one that had guided me through thousands of miles of city streets, but the words made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. In 500 feet, Turn right on Carmichael Avenue. I knew these streets like the lines on my palms. There was no Carmichael Avenue. Not here. Not anywhere in this city. I'd lived here my entire life. Driven every major road and most of the residential ones. The street she was directing me toward was actually Morrison Boulevard, a 4-lane artery that cut through the financial district. I glanced down at the GPS screen mounted on my dashboard. The blue line of my route stretched ahead, but instead of following Morrison Boulevard, it curved off into what should have been solid city blocks. The street names displayed in crisp white text: Carmichael Avenue, Riverside Drive, Hollow Creek Road. Names that sounded familiar in a way that made my skin crawl, like half-remembered lyrics from a song you can't quite place. I pulled over next to a 24-hour diner, its neon sign crackling in the humid air. The parking lot was empty, except for a lone pickup truck and my Honda Civic. Through the windows, I could see a waitress wiping down tables, moving through the fluorescent-lit space like a ghost in an aquarium. I picked up my phone and opened the rideshare app. No new rides. The map showed my car as a small white dot on Morrison Boulevard, exactly where I was. But the GPS unit, a separate device I'd bought because my phone's battery couldn't handle 12-hour shifts, still displayed that impossible route stretching into streets that didn't exist. I turned the GPS off and back on. The screen flickered, then settled into the familiar loading animation. When it finished, the map looked normal again. Morrison Boulevard was Morrison Boulevard. No Carmichael Avenue. No Riverside Drive. No Hollow Creek Road. For the next hour, everything was normal. 3 more rides. A drunk college kid who tipped in cash, a middle-aged man who spent the entire trip texting, and a woman who gave me directions to her apartment in a voice so soft I had to strain to hear her. The GPS behaved exactly as it should, guiding me through familiar streets with predictable efficiency. I started to relax. Maybe I'd been driving too many consecutive nights. Maybe the combination of caffeine and sleep deprivation was playing tricks on my perception. It wouldn't be the first time my mind had wandered into strange territory during the small hours of the morning. But at 4:15 a.m., with no passengers and the city settling into its deepest quiet, she spoke again. Route calculated. Follow Carmichael Avenue for 1.2 miles. This time, I was ready for it. I immediately looked at the screen, watching as the impossible streets materialized before my eyes. The route was more elaborate now, winding through a network of roads that seemed to overlay the real city like a second map printed on transparent paper. And there, at the end of the blue line, was a destination I hadn't noticed before. A red pin dropped at an address that made my breath catch. 1247 Riverside Drive. I knew that address, not because I'd been there, but because I'd almost been there. 3 years ago, on a night much like this one, I'd been driving home from a late shift at the warehouse job I'd held before UberX. I'd been exhausted, running on 4 hours of sleep spread across 2 days, when I dozed off at the wheel. Just for a second, maybe 2, but long enough for my car to drift across the center line. The screech of brakes and the blare of a horn had jolted me awake just in time to jerk the wheel back. The oncoming car, a red sedan with 2 people inside, had swerved hard to avoid me, their taillights disappearing around a curve as my heart hammered against my ribs. I'd pulled over and sat there for 20 minutes, shaking, knowing how close I'd come to destroying everything. The accident I'd almost caused would have happened at the intersection of Riverside Drive and Hollow Creek Road. 1247. Riverside Drive would have been right there, right where the impact would have occurred. But Riverside Drive and Hollow Creek Road didn't exist. They never had. I sat in my car outside the diner, staring at the GPS screen, watching the blue line pulse gently as if it were breathing. The route looked so real, so carefully detailed. Street names appeared and disappeared as I zoomed in and out. Traffic lights marked intersections. Even the estimated travel time updated as I watched. 12 minutes. My finger hovered over the screen. There was a cancel button in the corner, a simple X that would clear the route and return me to normal navigation. All I had to do was touch it. Instead, I put the car in drive. The turn onto what my GPS called Carmichael Avenue looked exactly like the turn onto Morrison Boulevard, because that's what it was. Same traffic light, same convenience store on the corner, same faded crosswalk paint. But as I followed the blue line, something felt different. The streetlights seemed dimmer, casting longer shadows between pools of yellow light. The buildings looked the same but somehow older, as if years had passed in the space between one block and the next. My odometer clicked steadily forward. 47,326 miles, 47,327, 47,328. But according to the GPS, I was traveling much further. The distance counter showed 2.1 miles covered when my odometer had advanced only 0.7 miles. It was as if I were traveling through space that existed only on the screen, phantom miles accumulating in a phantom journey. The voice guided me through turns that felt familiar, yet wrong. Left on Riverside Drive, which looked like the street behind the old courthouse but stretched further than it should have, lined with houses I didn't recognize despite having driven past this area hundreds of times. Right on Hollow Creek Road, where a creek that had been buried under concrete decades ago suddenly murmured audibly beside the asphalt, its voice mixing with the hum of my tires. Other cars appeared sporadically in my rearview mirror, their headlights following the same route. But when I glanced back more carefully, the lights seemed to belong to the same vehicles over and over. A dark SUV, a white sedan, a motorcycle whose engine I could hear but never see. They maintained the same distance, never getting closer, never falling behind, as if we were all trapped in the same repeating loop of road. The destination grew closer according to the GPS. 0.8 miles, 0.6 miles, 0.4 miles. My heart rate increased with each update. Whatever was waiting at 1247 Riverside Drive, I was almost there. That's when I saw my own car. It was parked on the side of the road ahead, hazard lights blinking in a steady rhythm. Same make, same model, same license plate number. Even the same small dent on the passenger side door where I'd backed into a post 2 months ago. I slowed down as I approached, trying to understand what I was seeing. The car looked empty, but the engine was running. I could see exhaust wisping from the tailpipe. I pulled up beside it and rolled down my window. The interior was identical to mine. Same black seat covers, same air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror, same fast food receipts scattered on the passenger seat. But there was no driver. My phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number. "Why did you stop?" I looked around, but the street was empty except for the 2 identical cars. No other vehicles, no pedestrians, no lit windows in the houses that lined both sides of the road. Just me and my reflection, sitting in cars that shouldn't both exist. Another text. "You're almost there." The GPS spoke again, her voice cutting through the silence. "In 0.2 miles, your destination will be on the right." I drove away from the parked car, watching it disappear in my rearview mirror, but somehow I could still see its hazard lights blinking in the distance, long after I should have lost sight of them. They followed me like red eyes, constant and unblinking. The landscape around me began to change in subtle ways. The houses grew older, their architecture shifting from suburban contemporary to something more traditional, more worn. Trees appeared where none had been before, their branches reaching across the road to form a canopy that blocked most of the streetlight. The asphalt beneath my tires felt rougher, and I could hear gravel crunching under my wheels despite the fact that the road looked perfectly paved. My phone buzzed again. "Do you remember what you almost did?" I tried to ignore it, but the message repeated every few seconds, each time from a different number. Different area codes, different exchange numbers, but the same question over and over. The text-to-speech function I'd never activated began reading them aloud, filling my car with a chorus of synthesized voices asking the same question in slightly different tones. "Destination ahead on the right," the GPS announced. I saw it before I understood what I was looking at. A house that shouldn't exist, sitting at an address that wasn't supposed to be real. It was a modest single-story home with brown shingles and white trim. A small front yard with a garden that looked like it had been tended recently. Warm light glowed behind curtained windows, and I could see shadows moving inside. But it was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. The house sat in a space that should have been occupied by a gas station. I'd filled up at that gas station dozens of times. The convenience store sold the worst coffee in the city and had a broken bell that chimed off key whenever someone opened the door. Yet here was this house, solid and real, with a mailbox that read 1247 in neat brass numbers. My odometer read 47,341 miles. According to my GPS, I'd traveled 8.3 miles from the diner, but I'd been driving for less than 30 minutes on roads that couldn't possibly accommodate that distance. I parked across the street and stared at the house. The shadows behind the curtains moved in patterns that suggested people going about their evening routines. Someone washing dishes at the kitchen sink. Someone settling into a chair in the living room. Normal domestic movements that should have been comforting, but instead filled me with a dread I couldn't name. My phone had gone silent, but the GPS continued to speak at regular intervals. You have arrived at your destination. You have arrived at your destination. I knew I should leave. Every rational part of my mind was screaming at me to turn around, to drive back through whatever impossible geography had brought me here, to return to the real world where gas stations existed at this address and Riverside Drive was just a name in my memory. But I couldn't move. Because as I sat there watching the shadows in the windows, I began to recognize them. The way the figure in the kitchen moved their hands while washing dishes. The particular way the person in the living room adjusted their position in their chair. I'd seen these movements before, 3 years ago, in the red sedan that had swerved to avoid my drifting car. In the split second before the other driver had corrected course, I'd glimpsed their faces. A young couple, probably heading home from a date or a late dinner. He'd been driving, she'd been in the passenger seat, both of them looking tired but content. They were the people I'd almost killed. And now, they were living in a house that existed at the address where their accident should have happened, going through the motions of a life they should have lost, in a place that occupied the same space as a gas station in a world where I'd managed to stay in my lane. The GPS spoke one final time. Route complete. Would you like to navigate to a new destination? I reached for the screen to cancel the route, but hesitated. My finger hovered over the button as I realized something that made my vision blur around the edges. If this house existed here, in this version of reality where the accident had happened, then where was I? What had become of the Frank who had dozed off, who had drifted across the center line, who had collided with the red sedan at exactly 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday night 3 years ago? My phone buzzed one last time. The message was from my own number. You never woke up. I pressed the cancel button. The house disappeared. The gas station materialized around me, exactly as it should be. Fluorescent lights, cracked pavement, the off-key bell chiming as someone opened the convenience store door. My car was parked at pump number 3, and according to the GPS, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. But my odometer still read 47,341 miles. And somewhere in the distance, so faint I might have imagined it, I could hear the sound of hazard lights clicking in a steady rhythm, as if another version of my car was still parked on Riverside Drive, waiting for a driver who would never return. I drove home that night, but the GPS stayed silent. No matter how many times I tried to activate it, no matter how many buttons I pressed, the screen remained dark. And when I finally fell asleep as the sun was rising, I dreamed of phantom roads that led to houses that shouldn't exist, where people lived lives they'd never had the chance to finish. The next night, I worked without the GPS, navigating by memory and street signs. But sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I'd catch a glimpse of blue lines on my phone screen, routes that appeared for just a moment before disappearing when I looked directly at them. And sometimes, late at night when the city was at its quietest, I'd hear that synthesized voice whispering through my car speakers, too low to make out the words but familiar enough to make my hands shake on the steering wheel. I never followed those phantom routes again, but I know they're still there, waiting. Story 9. The brass felt wrong in my hands from the moment I lifted it from the worn velvet cloth. Not temperature wrong, though it carried an odd chill that seemed to seep through my fingertips, but wrong in a way that made the hair on my forearms stand on end. 47 years of handling timepieces had given me an intuition about these things. a sense for the personality each clock carried. This one whispered of something I couldn't name. The man who'd brought it had been unremarkable in every way that mattered. Average height, forgettable features, clothes that suggested modest means, but careful maintenance. He'd spoken in that hurried manner of someone unused to conversation, explaining that the pocket watch had belonged to his grandfather, and requesting only that I make it work properly again. When I'd asked for his contact information, he'd scribbled an address on a scrap of paper with the kind of ballpoint pen that skips ink every few letters. That was 3 days ago. The address led to a vacant lot behind the old textile mill. Now, sitting in my workshop with the autumn rain drumming against the windows like impatient fingers, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake accepting the job. The watch sat before me on the felt-lined workspace, its silver case catching the amber light from my desk lamp in ways that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. The crystal face was pristine, unmarked by the scratches and cloudiness that typically accumulated over decades. Roman numerals marked the hours in elegant script, and the hands, delicate spears of blackened steel, moved with mechanical precision. Counterclockwise. I'd noticed it immediately, of course. In 47 years of clockwork, you develop an instinct for the natural rhythm of time. Watching those hands trace their backward path felt like watching a river flow uphill, fundamentally wrong in a way that made my chest tight. I'd opened the case, expecting to find crossed gears or a reversed spring mechanism, some obvious explanation for the peculiarity. Instead, I'd found movement that hummed with impossible perfection, each component aligned with master craftsmanship that I could barely comprehend, let alone replicate. The mechanism showed no signs of tampering, no crossed wires, no reversed assemblies. It simply ran backward, as if time itself had decided to retreat through this particular device. I'd photographed it naturally. Documentation was part of my process, insurance against accusations of damage or alteration. The first photo had turned out normally, a clear image of the watch face showing 3:17, hands positioned in their backward sweep. But when I'd looked at that photo later, my breath had caught in my throat. My reflection, visible in the polished surface of the case, showed a face I didn't recognize, deeply lined, with white hair and liver spots across hands that looked decades older than the ones currently gripping the camera. I deleted the photo immediately, assuming some trick of lighting or a smudge on the lens. The second photo had been worse. Now, on the third evening, I found myself reluctant to document anything further. The workshop felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had drawn closer while I wasn't paying attention. Outside, the rain had intensified to a steady downpour that masked the usual sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening. Mrs. Patterson's television news, the Garcia family's dinner conversations, the gentle hum of traffic on Maple Street, all of it muffled beneath the weight of water falling from a sky that seemed lower than it should be. I forced myself to focus on the mechanism. Whatever was causing the backward motion, it wasn't immediately visible in the gear train. I'd need to remove the movement entirely, examine each component under magnification. The process would take hours, require my full attention, and most importantly, would give me something concrete to focus on instead of the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. The case opened with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been in the confined space. As I lifted the movement free, supporting it with the specialized holders I'd used thousands of times before, the hands continued their reversed journey. 8:43, 8:42, 8:41, each second marked with mechanical precision, counting down toward what? I positioned my magnifying lens and leaned closer. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, gear teeth cut with tolerances that modern machinery could barely achieve, springs wound with tension that spoke of decades of expertise. Every surface gleamed with the kind of finish that came from hand polishing, hours of patient work by someone who understood that time itself deserved to be housed in perfection. But as I studied the mechanism, my peripheral vision caught something that made my stomach lurch. The coffee cup on my workbench, the one I'd knocked over earlier while reaching for a screwdriver, was no longer lying on its side in a brown stain. Instead, it sat upright, steam rising from liquid that I was certain I'd watched soak into the felt workspace covering hours ago. I jerked back from the magnifying lens, heart hammering against my ribs. The cup was definitely upright, definitely full, definitely steaming as if I'd just poured it. But I hadn't poured coffee in over 2 hours. The last time I'd made any was this morning, and I'd specifically remember knocking it over because I'd been annoyed at my own clumsiness. The watch continued its backward countdown. 7:23, 7:22, 7:21. I stood up too quickly, the workshop chair rolling backward until it struck the parts cabinet with a metallic clang. The sound echoed strangely in the small space, as if the room had grown larger to accommodate the reverberation. When I looked back at the workbench, the notebook where I'd been recording my observations was pristine. Not a mark on the pages where I was certain I'd written several paragraphs of analysis. My hands shook as I reached for the notebook, flipping through pages that should have contained 3 days' worth of notes about the watch. Empty. Every page clean and white, waiting for words that I was suddenly not sure I'd ever written. The sound of rain had stopped. I looked toward the window, but the view through the glass made no sense. Instead of the familiar sight of Oak Street with its modest houses and streetlights just beginning to flicker on in the growing dusk, I saw nothing. Not darkness, not a blank wall, but an absence that hurt to look at directly, as if the world beyond my workshop had simply ceased to exist. The watch face now read 6:15, hands continuing their relentless backward sweep. I forced myself to breathe slowly, in and out, the way I'd learned during the anxiety attacks that had followed my divorce. Stress could cause hallucinations, I knew that. Extended periods of concentration, inadequate sleep, the isolation of working alone, all of it could combine to create perceptual distortions. The coffee cup could be explained by absent-mindedness, the notebook by fatigue-induced memory lapses. Even the strange view from the window might be nothing more than the reflection of my desk lamp creating an optical illusion. But the watch continued to run backward, and with each passing second, I felt something in my chest tighten like a spring wound too far. I needed to document this properly. If I was having some kind of breakdown, evidence would be important for whatever treatment followed. If something genuinely supernatural was occurring, evidence would be even more crucial. I reached for my phone, hands steadier now that I had a plan, and opened the camera app. The first photo showed the workbench clearly, the watch with its backward-moving hands, the upright coffee cup, the pristine notebook. But when I switched to review the image, my breath caught again. In the reflection on the watch case, my face appeared decades older than it should be. Deep lines carved valleys around eyes that had clouded with cataracts. My hair, what remained of it, was white as bone. Hands visible in the shot showed the mottled skin and prominent veins of advanced age. I looked up from the phone screen to the mirror mounted above my parts cabinet. The reflection showed my normal face, lined but not deeply, hair gray but not white, eyes clear behind glasses that hadn't changed prescription in 2 years, 47 years old, looking perhaps 50 on a bad day. But when I raised the phone to take another photo, the camera screen showed that ancient version of myself, watching me with eyes that held knowledge I didn't want to possess. The watch read 5:08. Around me, the workshop began to change. Not all at once, but in subtle shifts that I caught in my peripheral vision. A broken gear on my parts tray reformed itself, metal edges flowing back together like water in reverse. A coffee ring stain on my workbench faded until the wood appeared freshly sealed. Tools that I'd worn smooth through years of use regained the sharp edges and bright finish they'd possessed when new. With growing horror, I realized that the backward motion of the watch wasn't just marking time, it was taking time, pulling everything in its vicinity back toward some previous state. The effect seemed to radiate outward from the mechanism in concentric circles, undoing changes, reversing entropy, making the present moment dissolve into yesterday, last week, last month. But what happened when it reached the moment it was searching for? What occurred when the mechanism found whatever specific point in time it was trying to reclaim? I needed to stop it. Whatever was happening, whatever impossible physics were at work, I had to find a way to halt the process before what? Before I aged backward into infancy? before the workshop reverted to raw lumber and empty space, before everything I knew ceased to exist in the face of relentless temporal retreat. My hands trembled as I reached for the watch. The moment my fingers made contact with the case, pain shot through my joints. Not sharp pain, but the deep ache of arthritis that I'd never experienced. Looking down, I saw my knuckles swollen and spotted with the kinds of age marks that belonged to someone decades older. The phone in my other hand showed the camera view still active, and in it I could see my face continuing to transform, cheeks hollowing, skin growing thin and translucent. But I could also feel the mechanism within the watch, its rhythm pulsing against my palm like a heartbeat. There was a pattern to it, a specific frequency that spoke of purpose rather than random malfunction. This wasn't broken clockwork. It was clockwork fulfilling its intended function. Someone had built this device to move backward through time, to search for a specific moment and draw everything around it into that search. The question was why. The watch face read 3:42, hands sweeping toward a destination I couldn't identify. Around me, the workshop continued its retreat into the past. Colors grew more vivid as paint recovered its original intensity. The familiar smell of machine oil was joined by the sharper sense of fresh wood and new metal. Even the air felt different, cleaner somehow, as if decades of accumulated dust and wear were simply dissolving. I tried to wind the watch forward, but the crown wouldn't turn in that direction. I tried to stop the hands, but they moved through my fingers as if passing through empty space. The mechanism had its own momentum now, its own purpose, and my attempts to interfere were as futile as trying to hold back a river with my bare hands. As the minutes continued to count down, 3:41, 3:40, 3:39, I began to suspect that this wasn't random mechanical failure at all. Someone had built this device deliberately, programmed it with a specific target date and time. Someone who wanted to undo something that had happened, to reach back through the years and reclaim a moment that had been lost. But whose moment? And what had they been trying to undo? The answer came to me with the sudden clarity of pieces clicking into place. The unremarkable man who'd brought the watch, with his hurried manner and forgettable features. The fake address that led to a vacant lot. The sense of wrongness I'd felt from the moment I'd touched the brass case. He hadn't been a customer at all. He'd been delivering the watch to this specific place, at this specific time, knowing exactly what would happen when I began to examine it. The backward countdown wasn't searching for a random moment in the past. It was targeting the moment when he'd first brought the watch to my shop, which meant that everything I'd experienced over the past 3 days was about to be erased. The discovery of the false address, my growing unease, the photographs and notes and evidence of temporal distortion, all of it would be undone when the watch reached its destination. The loop would close, the moment would reset, and I would find myself meeting that unremarkable man for the first time, accepting a repair job that would lead me inexorably back to this same revelation. The watch read 2:17. I could see it now in my mind, the pattern extending backward and forward through time like ripples in a pond. How many times had I already lived through this sequence? How many times had I discovered the truth only to have it stripped away when the clock completed its cycle? The workshop around me was reverting to its state from 3 days ago. But what if 3 days ago was itself a repetition of an earlier loop? What if I'd been trapped in this temporal circle for weeks, months, years, aging backward and forward through the same sequence of events, never retaining enough memory to break free? The thought filled me with a desperation that felt both fresh and achingly familiar. I grabbed my phone again, not to take photos, but to record a voice memo, some message to my future self that might survive the temporal reset. But when I opened the app, I found dozens of recordings already there, all of them in my own voice, all of them with timestamps that made no sense. Thomas, you have to find a way to break the pattern. The watch is designed to loop, but there has to be an off switch. The man who brought it isn't random. Look for connections to the previous owners. Check the city records for... Don't trust your memory. You've done this before. The coffee cup, the notebook, the photos. They're markers. When you see them changing, you know the loop is closing. My own voice. recorded at times when I had no memory of speaking, evidence of previous iterations, previous attempts to solve a puzzle that reset itself every time I got close to the answer. The watch read 1:08. As the final minutes counted down, I found myself thinking not about escape, but about acceptance. Perhaps some moments were meant to be relived, examined from every angle until their true meaning became clear. Perhaps the unknown craftsman who'd built this device hadn't intended it as a trap, but as a gift, an opportunity to perfect a moment, to explore every possibility within a bounded space of time. But if that were true, what was the moment being perfected? What was so important about my first encounter with the watch that it needed to be repeated endlessly? The workshop around me had almost completely reverted to its state from 3 days ago. My coffee cup sat empty on the workbench, waiting to be filled. My notebook lay open to a blank page, pen resting beside it. Even my own reflection in the mirror above the parts cabinet showed the face I'd worn at the beginning of the cycle. Tired but hopeful, unaware of the strange journey that lay ahead. The watch read 0:03. In those final seconds, I allowed myself one moment of perfect clarity. Whatever was happening to me, whatever impossible physics governed this pocket watch and its relentless backward journey, I was no longer the same person who'd first lifted it from its velvet cloth. Each loop might erase my memories, but it couldn't erase the changes to my soul. I'd gained something in these repeated encounters with mystery, a deeper understanding of time's fragility, of the thin line between sanity and madness, of the way reality itself could bend under the weight of human desire. The hands reached 0:0. The world dissolved into brass-colored light, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching my workshop door. A knock, polite but insistent. The voice of an unremarkable man asking if I had time to look at an old family heirloom, a pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather. I walked toward the door, my hand already reaching for the handle, knowing that I would open it, accept the watch, and begin the cycle again. But this time, perhaps, I would be ready for what was coming. This time, I might find a way to break free. Or perhaps breaking free was never the point at all. The knock came again, and I smiled as I turned the doorknob, wondering what new secrets this iteration would reveal about the impossible clockwork in my hands and the true nature of time itself. Sorry, 10. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I convinced myself it was exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. I'd been working late again, cataloging the newest acquisitions for the Whitmore private collection. The gallery's overhead lights hummed their familiar electric lullaby as I moved between the 19th century portraits that lined the mahogany-paneled walls. Each face seemed to follow my movements, but that was nothing new. Good portraiture does that. These masters had captured something eternal in their subjects' eyes, a trick of perspective and shadow that made the dead seem alive. That Tuesday morning, however, something felt different about the woman in the emerald dress. Lady Catherine Pemberton, according to the brass nameplate, had been painted sometime in the 1840s. The portrait showed her seated in a burgundy chair, hands folded primly in her lap, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I'd studied that painting dozens of times during my 3 years as curator here, memorized every brushstroke, every subtle gradation of color in her pale complexion. But that morning, her smile seemed wider. I stood before the painting for several minutes, my coffee growing cold in my hands, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I remembered. The change was so subtle it could have been a trick of the morning light streaming through the tall windows, casting different shadows across the canvas. Maybe I'd simply never noticed the full extent of her expression before. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the digital catalog photos I'd taken when the painting first arrived. There it was, Lady Catherine with the same pose, the same dress, the same background. But in my photo, her smile was definitely more restrained, more typical of Victorian propriety. My hands trembled slightly as I held the phone up next to the actual painting, comparing them side by side. The discrepancy was undeniable. I spent the rest of that day researching art restoration techniques, wondering if someone had been touching up the paintings without my knowledge. But Mr. Whitmore, the collection's owner, had been traveling in Europe for months. The cleaning staff wasn't allowed in the gallery unsupervised, and I was the only one with after-hours access. The security system showed no unauthorized entries. That night, I decided to stay even later than usual, working on inventory until well past midnight. The gallery took on a different character in the deep hours of night. The heating system's occasional groans echoed through the rooms, and the portraits seemed to absorb the lamplight, their faces disappearing into pools of shadow between the circles of illumination. I found myself glancing frequently at Lady Catherine, but she remained unchanged throughout the evening. By the time I finally locked up at 2 in the morning, I'd almost convinced myself the whole thing had been my imagination. The next morning shattered that illusion completely. Not only had Lady Catherine's smile grown even wider, now showing a hint of teeth, but Colonel Morrison in the adjacent portrait had shifted his gaze. Instead of looking slightly off to the left as he had for months, his stern eyes now stared directly ahead, seeming to track my movement across the room. My mouth went dry as I noticed something else. A thin line of what looked like wet paint along the bottom edge of Colonel Morrison's frame. I touched it with my fingertip. The substance was tacky, with the distinct smell of linseed oil and pigment. Fresh paint. Impossible as it seemed, someone, or something, had been altering these paintings during the night. I called Mr. Whitmore's assistant, but she assured me no conservators or restores had been scheduled. The building's security company confirmed that their cameras had recorded nothing unusual, though the guard mentioned something odd about the footage from the gallery itself. When he pulled up the recordings on his laptop, my blood chilled. Every camera angle that should have shown the portrait wall displayed nothing but black screen from approximately midnight to dawn. Not the grainy darkness of a low-light recording, but pure, absolute black, as if something had drained all light from that section of the gallery. The cameras pointing at other walls worked perfectly fine. Over the following days, the changes accelerated. Lady Catherine's smile broadened into something that could no longer be called pleasant. Her eyes, previously demure and downcast, began to lift, focusing on some point just behind my shoulder whenever I stood before her portrait. The colonel's expression grew more severe, his brow furrowing deeper, and I swear I could see his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. But these were just the beginning. By the end of the week, I discovered that Lord Ashworth, painted in a library setting, no longer held a leather-bound book in his hands. Instead, his fingers gripped what appeared to be a brass key, its metal surface gleaming as if recently polished. The strange thing was, I could find no trace of overpainted areas where a book might have been erased. The key looked as if it had always been there, as integral to the composition as any other element. The young woman in the blue silk gown, whose nameplate had mysteriously gone missing, had turned her head so far that her face was now completely in profile, gazing toward the portrait of the dark-haired gentleman in the naval uniform. And he, in turn, seemed to be returning her gaze with an expression of longing that hadn't been there before. It was as if the portraits were developing relationships with each other, conducting silent conversations across the gallery walls while I slept. Sleep had become elusive anyway. I found myself lying awake in my apartment, wondering what transformations were occurring in the gallery. During the day, I began taking detailed photographs of each painting from multiple angles, trying to create an objective record of their appearances. But even my camera seemed to conspire against my sanity. Photos taken hours apart would show subtle differences that my equipment shouldn't have been able to capture unless the paintings were actually changing. The temperature in the gallery had dropped noticeably, requiring me to wear a jacket even during the day. My breath misted in the air near certain portraits, particularly around the newer editions. And there were new editions now. Paintings that appeared overnight on previously blank sections of wall, as if they were materializing from the mahogany paneling itself. These new portraits followed the same artistic style as the original collection, but depicted people I'd never seen before. A severe-looking woman in black mourning dress, her eyes red-rimmed as though she'd been crying. A middle-aged man with unusual scarring on his left cheek, his smile predatory and unsettling. A young couple holding hands, their faces bearing an expression of shared terror, as if they were perpetually witnessing something horrible. just beyond the frame's edge. Each new portrait felt like a violation, an unwelcome guest that had invaded the gallery's carefully curated atmosphere. But more disturbing was the way they seemed to influence the original paintings. Lady Catherine's smile now held a cruel edge that reminded me of the scarred man's expression. The colonel's stern gaze had taken on the same haunted quality as the terrified couple. I began to suspect that the portraits were not just changing, they were corrupting each other. The smell of fresh paint grew stronger each morning, accompanied by other odors I couldn't quite identify. Something like old parchment and candle wax, tinged with the musty scent of fabric that had been stored in damp cellars for decades. Sometimes I caught whiffs of expensive perfume or the leather and tobacco smell of a gentleman's study, as if the painted worlds were bleeding their atmospheres into my reality. My hands developed a tremor that made cataloging work difficult. Colleagues who called began commenting on how tired I sounded, how distracted I seemed. I stopped taking their calls. 3 weeks after the changes began, I made the discovery that destroyed the last vestiges of my rational skepticism. I arrived at the gallery that morning to find a new portrait hanging in the place of honor, the central wall where visitors' eyes would naturally fall upon entering. It showed a man in his late 30s with prematurely graying hair at his temples, wearing a navy blue jacket I'd never owned, and standing in what appeared to be a 19th century drawing room I'd never seen. The man in the portrait was unmistakably me, but this painted version of myself held details that made no sense. The jacket was cut in a style that predated my birth by over a century. The background showed elaborate wallpaper patterns and furniture that belonged in a Victorian mansion, not any place I'd ever lived or visited. Most unsettling of all, the painted William's expression carried a knowledge that the real William didn't possess. A sad, resigned acceptance of something I couldn't understand. As I stared at my own face looking back at me from within an ornate golden frame, I noticed something that made my knees weak. The painted William's lips were moving, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. He was trying to warn me about something. I spent that entire day in a state of numb shock, avoiding the central wall, but feeling the painted eyes of my doppelganger tracking my movements throughout the gallery. The other portraits seemed more animated than ever, their subtle movements now clearly visible if I caught them in my peripheral vision. Lady Catherine's smile had become a rictus grin. The colonel appeared to be shouting silently about something urgent. The naval gentleman had stepped completely out of his original pose, and now pressed his hands against the inner surface of his frame as if trying to break through glass. That night, I made a decision that probably saved what remained of my sanity. I set up a cot in the gallery's storage room and resolved to stay awake all night, to finally witness whatever was happening to these paintings in the dark hours when the cameras recorded only blackness. I armed myself with a thermos of coffee, a powerful flashlight, and a desperate need to understand what was slowly driving me mad. The transformation began just after midnight. At first, I thought my eyes were adjusting poorly to the darkness, but then I realized that darkness itself was the problem. The shadows weren't simply the absence of light. They were moving, flowing across the walls like thick liquid, pooling around the frames and seeping into the painted surfaces. The portraits began to glow with their own internal illumination, and I watched in transfixed horror as the painted figures stepped out of their frames entirely. Lady Catherine emerged first, her emerald dress rustling as she moved with fluid grace across the gallery floor. Her terrible smile was even worse in 3 dimensions, stretching her face into something inhuman. The colonel followed, his uniform materializing into solid fabric as he stepped down from his frame, his hand resting on a sword that gleamed with more than paint. One by one, they all emerged. The naval gentleman, the mourning woman, the scarred man with his predatory grin, the terrified couple still holding hands. They moved through the gallery like actors in a silent play, interacting with each other in ways their static portraits had only hinted at. But most terrifying of all was my painted double. He stepped from his frame with the confident stride of someone who belonged in this impossible scene, someone who understood the rules of this nocturnal world. As he approached the storage room where I crouched in terror, I saw that his Victorian-era clothing was not a costume but his natural attire, as much a part of him as his skin. When he spoke, his voice was my voice, but carrying an accent and cadence that belonged to another century entirely. He told me that I had been chosen to join them, that my daily presence in the gallery had slowly prepared me for this transformation. Each night I'd spent cataloging their world. I'd been cataloging myself into it. The painted William was not a copy. He was who I was becoming, who I'd always been destined to become. The gallery was not just a collection of portraits, but a kind of way station between worlds, a place where the boundary between art and reality grew thin enough for passage. Those who spent enough time among the paintings would eventually find themselves painted into the collection, joining the eternal tableau of figures who existed in the spaces between brushstrokes. I understood then why the cameras recorded only darkness. It wasn't that the light was being absorbed. It was that during those midnight hours, the gallery existed partially outside normal reality, in a realm where 19th century rules of physics and perception held sway. As dawn approached, the painted figures began returning to their frames, but not before my doppelganger made me an offer that still haunts my dreams. I could join them willingly, step into the portrait that bore my face and accept my place in their eternal world. Or I could continue fighting the inevitable transformation, growing madder each day as the boundary between my reality and theirs continued to erode. The choice, he said with my own voice, was mine to make, but it would need to be made soon. I fled the gallery that morning and never returned. That was 6 months ago. I've moved across the country, taken a job in a completely different field, tried to rebuild my life away from anything connected to art or paintings. But the changes that began in the Whitmore Gallery have followed me here. Sometimes, when I catch my reflection in mirrors or store windows, I see traces of that Victorian jacket around my shoulders. My accent has begun to shift subtly, taking on inflections that don't belong to my generation. And lately, I've been having vivid dreams of drawing rooms and gas-lit streets that feel more like memories than imagination. Most disturbing of all, yesterday I found a brass key in my pocket, the same key that Lord Ashworth had been holding in his transformed portrait. I have no memory of acquiring it, no idea what lock it might fit. But somehow I know exactly what it's for. The painted William was right about one thing. The choice is mine to make. I can continue this half-existence, caught between two realities, slowly losing pieces of myself to a world that exists in the spaces between brushstrokes. Or I can return to the gallery, find my portrait hanging on that central wall, and step into the frame where I belong. The key grows heavier in my pocket each day, and I find myself walking toward the train station more frequently, my feet carrying me toward a destination my rational mind rejects, but my painted soul recognizes as home. After all, how long can a man run from his own portrait? The answer, I fear, is not much longer. Story 11. The night shift at the Grandmont Hotel had always been a sanctuary of sorts. Quiet corridors, empty rooms, and the comforting weight of routine. For 3 years, I'd walked these halls between midnight and dawn, armed with nothing more than a flashlight, radio, and the kind of practiced indifference that comes from hearing too many ghost stories. The hotel's reputation for supernatural encounters was good for business, drawing thrill seekers and paranormal investigators. But I'd never seen anything more unsettling than a flickering fluorescent bulb or the occasional draft that made curtains dance. That changed on a Tuesday in October, when the autumn air had turned sharp and the old building seemed to creak more than usual, as if the cold was awakening something in its bones. The first sign should have been the silence. Not the usual quiet that settled over the hotel after the last guest retired, but something deeper, an absence that felt almost physical, pressing against my eardrums like water. Even the grandfather clock in the lobby had stopped its familiar ticking, though I'd wound it myself just hours earlier. The building's ancient heating system, normally a symphony of clangs and hisses, had fallen mute. I was conducting my 2 a.m. rounds, moving through the 3rd floor with the mechanical precision of countless previous nights, when I noticed room 317's door standing slightly ajar. The brass number plate caught the hallway's amber light, winking at me like an eye. I approached with more curiosity than concern. Guests sometimes left their doors open while they stepped out for ice, or ventured down to the bar for a nightcap, though at this hour, such movements were rare. The gap was perhaps 6 inches wide, enough to reveal a slice of darkness within. I raised my hand to knock, following protocol, when something in my peripheral vision made me turn toward the far end of the corridor. The figure stood motionless about 30 feet away, where the hallway terminated in a large window that normally offered a view of the hotel's gardens. Tall, perhaps 6.5 feet, and draped entirely in what appeared to be dark fabric that might have been a cloak or oversized coat. The material hung heavy and still, unaffected by any draft, and where a face should have been, there was only shadow within shadow. My first instinct wasn't fear, but confusion. Had one of the guests decided to wander the halls in some elaborate costume? Was this part of some late-night paranormal tour I hadn't been informed about? I called out softly, not wanting to wake the other guests, asking if everything was all right. The figure didn't respond, didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. It simply stood there, and despite the absence of visible eyes, I felt with absolute certainty that it was watching me. The sensation of being observed crept up my spine like ice water. Every instinct screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with what I was seeing, though I couldn't articulate why. The figure's stillness was too complete, too perfect. Even mannequins seemed more alive in comparison. I took a step backward, then another, keeping my eyes fixed on the motionless form. That's when the lights began to fail. The fluorescent fixture directly above the figure went first, plunging that section of corridor into darkness with a soft electric hum that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Then the next light failed, and the next, creating a wave of darkness that crept toward me with deliberate slowness. Each bulb didn't simply burn out. They dimmed gradually, as if something was slowly draining their power, their light dying with almost organic sluggishness. My hand fumbled for the radio clipped to my belt, fingers trembling slightly as I tried to raise dispatch. The device crackled to life, but instead of the familiar voice of Sarah, the overnight operator, I heard only static. Thick, distorted white noise that seemed to writhe and pulse with its own rhythm. I adjusted the volume, checked the frequency, but the static persisted, growing louder and more chaotic. Then, emerging from the electronic snow like something surfacing from deep water, came a voice. It was male, deep, and utterly calm, speaking words that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my skull. The voice suggested that I should turn around, that I should stop looking, that I should forget what I'd seen and return to the security office. The suggestions felt less like commands and more like thoughts that weren't quite my own, intimate and invasive in a way that made my skin crawl. I blinked, a reflexive attempt to clear my vision and regain some sense of reality, and when my eyes opened, the figure had moved. It now stood perhaps 15 feet away, having covered the distance in absolute silence. The dark fabric still hung motionless around its form, but somehow the quality of its stillness had changed. Where before it had seemed like a statue, now it felt coiled, potential energy waiting to unfold. The absence where its face should have been seemed deeper, more complete, as if it were a hole punched through reality itself. Terror hit me then, not the quick spike of adrenaline that comes from a sudden scare, but a slow, creeping dread that seemed to seep through my bones. This wasn't human. This wasn't anything that belonged in my carefully ordered world of routine patrols and incident reports. The very air around the figure felt wrong, charged with a malevolence that made my teeth ache. I turned and ran. My footsteps echoed through the corridor like gunshots, abnormally loud in the oppressive silence that had settled over the building. I didn't look back, couldn't look back, as I fled toward the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time in my haste to reach the security office on the ground floor. Behind me I heard nothing, which somehow made everything worse. If the figure was following, it moved without sound, without the whisper of fabric or the fall of footsteps. The security office had always been my refuge, a small room filled with monitors, communication equipment, and the reassuring glow of technology. I burst through the door and immediately began checking the camera feeds. scanning each screen for any sign of what I'd encountered. The third-floor corridor appeared normal, well-lit, empty, peaceful. I rewound the footage, searching for any trace of the figure, but found nothing. According to the cameras, I had spent several minutes standing alone in an empty hallway, apparently having a conversation with thin air. The rational part of my mind seized on this evidence. Perhaps I'd been more tired than I'd realized. Perhaps the long hours and irregular sleep schedule had finally caught up with me, manifesting in hallucinations born from the hotel's reputation and the power of suggestion. The explanation felt forced, but I clung to it desperately, preferring the possibility of a mental break to the alternative. I was reviewing the footage for the third time when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Monitor 7 showed the exterior view of my apartment building, 12 blocks away. It was a feed I'd never questioned. The security system monitored several properties owned by the hotel's parent company, including the modest apartment complex where employees like myself were housed. The camera was positioned to watch the main entrance, providing a clear view of the front door and the small lobby beyond. The figure stood just outside my apartment door. It was the same impossible stillness, the same dark drapery, the same absence where a face should be. But this time, it seemed to be waiting. The timestamp showed the current time, 3:17 a.m., meaning this was happening now, in real time, while I sat 12 blocks away staring at a screen. My apartment was on the 4th floor. There was no elevator in the building. Even if someone had somehow gained access, they would have had to climb 4 flights of stairs and navigate a hallway filled with other residents. The building's security was minimal, a simple lock on the main door and individual keys for each unit. But the idea that this figure had somehow known where I lived, had traveled there while I was reviewing footage, and was now standing outside my home defied all logic. I reached for the phone to call the police, then hesitated. What would I tell them? That I'd seen something that wasn't there, captured on cameras that showed nothing. That a figure I'd hallucinated was now standing outside my apartment. Even if they took the call seriously, by the time they arrived, whatever was happening would be over, one way or another. The radio crackled again, that same thick static, and through it came the voice once more. This time it suggested that I should go home, that I should check on my apartment, that I shouldn't keep it waiting much longer. The suggestions felt stronger now, more insistent, and I realized with growing horror that part of me wanted to comply. Some deep, primitive part of my brain was actually considering leaving the safety of the security office, driving across town in the middle of the night, and confronting whatever was waiting for me. The compulsion felt alien, as if my thoughts were being rewritten by an external force. I forced myself to look away from Monitor 7, to focus on the other screens showing the hotel's empty corridors and peaceful guest rooms. Everything appeared normal, mundane, reassuringly boring. Guests slept safely in their beds. The lobby remained quiet and welcoming. The ancient elevator sat motionless between floors, its brass gates closed and locked. But when I glanced back at Monitor 7, the figure was gone. The camera showed only an empty hallway, fluorescent lights humming overhead, my apartment door closed and apparently undisturbed. I rewound the footage, searching for the moment of departure, but found nothing. One frame showed the figure standing there, patient and motionless. The next showed an empty corridor. There was no transition, no movement, no explanation. My hands shook as I reached for the logbook, the simple spiral notebook where I recorded each night's events. The act of writing had always been grounding for me, a way to impose order on chaos and transform confusion into facts. But as I tried to formulate the night's events into coherent sentences, the words seemed inadequate, almost laughable in their inability to capture what I'd experienced. The radio remained silent now, but I kept expecting it to crackle back to life with more suggestions, more intimate invasions of my thoughts. Every shadow in the security office seemed deeper than it should be. Every reflection in the monitor screens might be hiding something just out of sight. The familiar hum of electronic equipment had taken on an ominous quality, as if the machines themselves were complicit in whatever was happening. I completed my shift mechanically, walking through the motions of routine while my mind raced in circles. When the morning security guard arrived at 6 a.m., I handed over the keys and logbook with minimal conversation, claiming only that it had been a quiet night. How could I explain that reality itself seemed to have developed cracks, that something had slipped through those fissures and was now aware of my existence? The drive home through the morning traffic felt surreal, as if I were viewing the world through thick glass. Other drivers navigated their commutes with casual efficiency, unaware that the fundamental rules of existence might be negotiable. The radio played classic rock and weather updates, the voices of DJs discussing sports scores and weekend plans with the kind of easy normalcy that seemed foreign to me now. I parked outside my building and sat in the car for several minutes, studying the entrance where the figure had supposedly stood. The morning light revealed nothing unusual, just the same scuffed linoleum, the same institutional paint, the same collection of mailboxes that I passed every day. A neighbor emerged walking her dog, offering a cheerful wave that I returned automatically. My apartment appeared undisturbed. The locks were secure, the windows intact, everything exactly as I'd left it 12 hours earlier. I searched every room methodically, checking closets and looking under furniture with the kind of paranoid thoroughness that would have embarrassed me under normal circumstances. Nothing was out of place. Nothing had been disturbed. But as I prepared for sleep, closing the blackout curtains against the morning sun, I noticed something that made my chest tighten with renewed dread. There were no footprints in the hallway carpet, no signs that anyone had stood outside my door for any length of time. But the carpet itself looked different, compressed in a vaguely humanoid shape, as if something impossibly heavy had stood there for hours, leaving an impression that defied explanation. I stared at that subtle distortion in the fabric until my eyes watered, trying to convince myself it had always been there, that I'd simply never noticed it before. But as I watched, the impression seemed to grow more defined, more deliberate, as if whatever had created it was slowly pressing down harder from somewhere I couldn't see. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of dark corridors and watching shadows, of voices that spoke without sound, and footsteps that left no trace. I woke repeatedly, each time convinced that I'd heard something moving in the apartment. But each investigation revealed only empty rooms, and the growing certainty that my world had fundamentally changed. The figure hadn't appeared in my peripheral vision or emerged from the darkness like some dramatic movie monster. It had simply been there, patient and inexplicable, waiting at the end of a corridor I'd walked countless times before. And now it knew where I lived. As I lay in bed watching the shadows shift across my ceiling, I realized that the most terrifying part wasn't what I'd seen, but what I couldn't prove. The cameras had recorded nothing. The building's security showed no signs of intrusion. Every piece of evidence suggested that the entire encounter had been a product of stress, sleep deprivation, and an overactive imagination fed by too many ghost stories. But the impression in the carpet disagreed, and somewhere in the distance I could swear I heard the sound of a radio crackling to life, carrying suggestions that felt less like thoughts and more like inevitabilities, patient and persistent as the tide. The voice was back, and this time, it was calling me home. Story 12. The notification sound had become my enemy. Every ping from the company server made my stomach clench, knowing what I might find waiting in the queue. 3 weeks had passed since the first impossible email arrived, and I still couldn't explain what was happening to our system, or to me. My name is George, and I've been managing IT infrastructure for Hartwell & Associates for 12 years. I know every cable, every server, every line of code that keeps this place running. I understand the logical flow of data, the predictable patterns of network traffic, the reassuring certainty of ones and zeros. What I don't understand is how Margaret Chen keeps sending emails from her company account when she's been dead for 4 years. The first message appeared on a Tuesday morning in October. I was running my usual diagnostics when Sarah from accounting called, her voice tight with confusion. She'd received an email from Margaret asking about quarterly projections for a client that had left the company 2 years ago. Margaret's account had been deactivated within hours of her funeral. I'd done it myself, following protocol, archiving her data, and purging her credentials from our domain. I assured Sarah it was probably a delayed delivery from our backup systems, some glitch in the mail queue. These things happened. But when I pulled up the message headers, my coffee grew cold in my hands. The timestamp showed it had been sent at 3:17 a.m. that morning, not 4 years ago. The routing information traced back to our own mail servers, as if Margaret had been sitting at her old desk in the dark, typing away. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe someone had spoofed her address, or there was a security breach I hadn't detected. I ran every scan I could think of, combed through the server logs until my eyes burned, but found nothing out of place. The email existed. It was legitimate according to every diagnostic tool at my disposal, and it should have been impossible. Then came the second one. David Martinez from legal received a message from his former colleague, Robert Kim, who'd passed away 3 years prior from a heart attack. Robert's email contained a detailed analysis of a case that hadn't existed when he was alive, complete with references to recent court decisions and current legislation. The writing style was unmistakably his, verbose, methodical, peppered with the legal jargon he'd loved to use. But Robert had been cremated and scattered in a place he'd never seen these new cases, never read these recent rulings. The third email shattered my careful rationalization. It was addressed to me personally, from Thomas Bradley, our former head of IT who'd trained me when I started here. Thomas had died in a car accident 18 months ago, and his account had been the first I'd ever had to deactivate after losing a colleague. The subject line read, "System anomalies. Urgent review required." His message was brief, written in the same direct style I remembered from our daily check-ins. He mentioned specific server configurations that had been implemented only last month, referenced new security protocols I'd installed just weeks ago. The email signature contained his old extension number and office location, as if nothing had changed. But it was the attachment that made my hands shake as I tried to open it. A photograph, crisp and recent, showing the view from my office window. Not just any view, the exact angle from my chair, including the new construction across the street that had only begun after Thomas's death. In the bottom corner of the image, reflected faintly in the window glass, I could make out a figure sitting at my desk. The resolution was too poor to see clearly, but the posture was unmistakably mine. I took a sick day and spent it walking around my neighborhood, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Someone was playing an elaborate prank, or I was suffering from some kind of breakdown. The stress of managing our increasingly complex systems, the long hours, the pressure, maybe my mind was manufacturing these impossible scenarios. But when I returned to work the next morning, there were 17 new emails waiting. 17 different deceased employees, reaching out to current staff members with messages that blended intimate memories of shared experiences with knowledge they couldn't possibly possess. Margaret sent detailed instructions for updating software that hadn't existed when she was alive. Robert provided legal advice about contracts written after his death. Thomas offered technical solutions to problems that had only emerged in recent weeks. The pattern became clear as I analyzed the communications. These weren't random messages or automated responses. The dead were having conversations. Lisa from HR received an email from Margaret asking about her new apartment. Margaret's follow-up message arrived within minutes of Lisa's reply, commenting on specific details about the neighborhood that weren't mentioned in Lisa's response. Details that would only be known by someone who had seen the place in person. The conversation continued throughout the day, Margaret offering decorating advice and sharing memories of her own first apartment. Memories that felt too vivid and personal to be fabricated. David found himself in an ongoing legal debate with Robert about a current case. Robert's responses arrived faster than humanly possible, addressing David's arguments point by point with citations that David had to look up to verify. The legal reasoning was flawless, the knowledge comprehensive, the timing impossible. I monitored every keystroke, every packet of data flowing through our network. The emails were originating from within our own system, but the physical locations traced back to servers that showed no signs of unauthorized access. It was as if our deceased colleagues were sitting at workstations that existed in some parallel version of our office, typing responses to conversations happening in real time. The breakthrough came when I noticed the meeting requests. Thomas had begun scheduling video conferences with me, sending calendar invitations for technical reviews that appeared legitimate in every way except for their impossibility. The meeting rooms were real locations in our building. The time slots were available. The agenda items were relevant to current projects. When I tried to join the first meeting, the conference room was empty, but my laptop registered another participant in the virtual space, a user account that belonged to a dead man. Margaret started booking training sessions with the accounting team, sending detailed presentation materials for software updates that were scheduled to be implemented next month. Her calendar invitations included attachments showing seating charts for the conference room, with specific positions marked for each attendee. The precision was unsettling, as if she had been observing our recent meetings and taking careful notes about who preferred which seats. Robert scheduled a legal seminar for the entire staff, ostensibly to discuss new compliance requirements. His invitation specified exact positions where each employee should sit in the main conference room, down to chair numbers and spatial arrangements that seemed oddly deliberate. The timing coincided with a mandatory all-hands meeting that had already been planned, as if he somehow knew about our existing schedule. It was while reviewing these meeting invitations that I discovered the real pattern. Hidden in the metadata of each calendar entry, embedded in fields that wouldn't be visible to casual users, were strings of coordinates. Not GPS coordinates, spatial references that seemed to correspond to locations within our building. When I mapped them out, they formed a precise geometric pattern centered on the main conference room. The coordinates were accompanied by timestamps, all pointing to the same moment, 3:17 p.m. on Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week from when I first discovered them. That was the time of our quarterly all-hands meeting, when every employee would be gathered in the main conference room for mandatory attendance. I spent the rest of the week analyzing those coordinates, trying to understand their significance. They corresponded to specific points throughout the building, not just the conference room, but locations in hallways, elevators, stairwells, and emergency exits. Each coordinate was associated with an employee name, creating a map of where everyone should be positioned at that crucial moment. The dead weren't just sending emails. They were orchestrating something. As Friday afternoon approached, I felt a growing sense of dread that had nothing to do with technical failures or system anomalies. The emails had become more frequent, more insistent. Margaret sent detailed floor plans to various employees, highlighting specific routes through the building. Robert provided timing schedules disguised as legal procedure recommendations. Thomas offered technical justifications for why certain employees should arrive early and position themselves in particular locations. The most disturbing aspect was how willingly everyone complied. My colleagues had begun treating these communications as normal workplace correspondence, following the instructions without question. Sarah rearranged her schedule to arrive at the specified time. David printed out the materials Robert had sent and prepared to present them during the meeting. Lisa coordinated with other departments to ensure everyone would be in their assigned positions. I was the only one who seemed to recognize the impossibility of what was happening, the only one questioning why dead people were giving us instructions about where to stand and when to gather. But even as I watched my colleagues follow these otherworldly directives, I couldn't shake the growing certainty that I was supposed to be part of this arrangement too. Thursday evening brought a final message from Thomas, addressed specifically to me. The subject line read, "Final system check, your position required." His email was longer than the others, filled with technical specifications and network diagnostics that seemed entirely normal until I reached the end. The last paragraph contained instructions for me to position myself at a specific coordinate in the server room at exactly 3:17 p.m. on Friday, ostensibly to monitor system performance during the all-hands meeting. The coordinate corresponded to a location directly beneath the main conference room. I stared at that email until my vision blurred, trying to understand what Thomas was asking me to do. The technical justification was sound. It made sense to monitor the servers during a large meeting when network traffic would spike. But the precision of the timing, the specificity of the location, the fact that the request came from a dead man, none of it felt like coincidence. Friday morning arrived gray and overcast. the building humming with unusual activity as employees prepared for the quarterly meeting. I watched from my office as people moved through the hallways, each following routes that seemed to correspond with the coordinates I'd mapped out. Margaret's suggested pathways, Robert's timing recommendations, Thomas's technical requirements. Everyone was unconsciously participating in some elaborate choreography orchestrated by the dead. By noon, the emails had stopped entirely. No new messages, no final instructions, no last-minute adjustments to the plan. The silence felt more ominous than all the impossible communications that had preceded it. I sat in my office, watching the clock and trying to decide whether to follow Thomas's instructions or evacuate the building entirely. At 3:10 p.m., I found myself walking toward the server room, my feet moving despite my mind's protests. The coordinate Thomas had specified was in the far corner, behind a rack of backup drives that rarely needed attention. As I approached the location, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. The floor tiles in that exact spot had been recently disturbed. The adhesive was fresh, the edges slightly raised as if someone had lifted them and replaced them within the past few days. But I was the only one with access to this room, the only one who ever came down here, and I certainly hadn't done any maintenance on the flooring. The timestamp on my phone read 3:16 p.m. I knelt down and pressed my hand against the suspicious tiles, feeling them shift slightly under pressure. Something was beneath the floor, something that hadn't been there before. The building's original blueprints flashed through my memory. I'd studied them countless times while planning network installations. This area should have been solid concrete, nothing but foundation and earth below. As the clock turned to 3:17 p.m., I heard a sound that didn't belong in the server room. Footsteps, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere beneath me. Not the clicking of heels on concrete, but the soft shuffle of people moving carefully through a confined space. Multiple people, all walking in perfect synchronization. The sounds were joined by voices, muffled but recognizable. Margaret's laugh, the same laugh I'd heard echoing through the halls when she was alive. Robert's distinctive cough, which had been his trademark during long legal presentations. Thomas's habit of humming while he worked, a tune I hadn't heard since his funeral. Above me, the muffled sounds of the all-hands meeting filtered down through the ceiling, chairs scraping against floors, the murmur of conversation, the familiar rhythm of a corporate gathering. But below me, in a space that shouldn't exist, another meeting was taking place. A gathering of people who shouldn't be able to attend any meeting ever again. I pressed my ear to the floor and listened to the impossible sounds of my dead colleagues, somewhere beneath the building, commenting on the presentations happening above them. Their voices were clearer now, discussing quarterly projections and legal requirements and technical specifications with the same professional competence they'd shown in life. But there was something else in their tones, something expectant and urgent, as if they were waiting for a specific moment to arrive. That moment came at 3:23 p.m. The voices below suddenly stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Above me, the sounds from the conference room also ceased, as if every person in the building had frozen simultaneously. The server fans continued their electronic hum. The air conditioning cycled through its programmed routine, but every human sound had vanished. Then, slowly, deliberately, I heard the sound of applause. It began below me, in that impossible space beneath the foundation, and gradually spread upward through the building. The dead were clapping, their appreciation echoing up through concrete and steel and finding resonance in the living world above. Within moments, the applause from the conference room joined in, creating a symphony of appreciation that connected two groups of employees, separated by death and architectural impossibility. I remained crouched on the floor, listening to this collaboration between the living and the dead, understanding finally that the emails had never been random communications. They had been invitations to a meeting that spanned the boundaries between worlds, a quarterly review that included participants from both sides of existence. The applause continued for exactly 1 minute, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The normal sounds of the building resumed. Conversations, footsteps, the everyday noise of a workplace returning to its routine. But below me, the impossible voices had fallen silent once again, leaving only the whisper of air moving through spaces that shouldn't exist. I stood up slowly, my legs cramping from the prolonged crouch, and looked around the server room that had served as my window into something beyond rational explanation. The equipment hummed peacefully, the status lights blinked their reassuring patterns, and the floor tiles lay flat and undisturbed, as if I had imagined the entire experience. But in my pocket, my phone buzzed with a new email notification. The message was from Thomas, sent at 3:24 p.m., 1 minute after the applause had ended. The subject line read, "Meeting minutes, distribution required." The body of the email contained detailed notes from the gathering I had just witnessed, complete with action items and follow-up tasks for both living and deceased participants. At the bottom, highlighted in bold text, was a single line that made my hands shake as I read it. Next quarterly review scheduled for January 15th, 2025. All staff attendance mandatory. As I write this, 3 months later, I still don't know if what happened that Friday afternoon was real, or if I experienced some kind of breakdown triggered by stress and overwork. The security footage from that day shows me entering the server room at 3:10 p.m. and standing motionless in the corner for 17 minutes before leaving. There's no audio recording, no evidence of the voices I heard, or the applause that connected two impossible meetings. But the emails continue to arrive, always from accounts that should have been deactivated years ago, always containing information that shouldn't be accessible to the dead. My colleagues still respond to these messages as if they were perfectly normal workplace communications, following instructions and attending meetings organized by people who no longer exist in any conventional sense. And every morning when I arrive at work, I check the calendar for January 15th, wondering if I'll find a meeting invitation waiting for me, wondering if I'll be expected to resume my position in the server room while the dead conduct their quarterly review in the space beneath our feet. The notification sound still makes my stomach clench, but now it's accompanied by a different kind of dread. Not the fear of technical failure or system anomalies, but the growing certainty that some meetings are more important than life or death, and that perfect attendance might be required regardless of which side of existence you happen to occupy. I keep telling myself there has to be a logical explanation for all of this. But late at night, when the building is empty and the servers hum their electronic lullabies, I sometimes hear the faint sound of typing coming from offices that have been vacant for years. The rhythm is familiar, the cadence unmistakable, and the knowledge that my dead colleagues are still working, still contributing, still participating in the endless routine of corporate life is somehow more terrifying than any supernatural explanation I could imagine. The worst part isn't wondering if I'm losing my mind. The worst part is the growing suspicion that I'm not, and that the boundary between the living and the dead is far more permeable than I ever wanted to believe, especially when the quarterly review date approaches, and I find myself automatically checking my calendar for available meeting rooms, as if preparing to attend a gathering where half the participants will be people who should no longer exist. But they do exist, somewhere beneath the foundation of our building, in offices that mirror our own, typing emails on computers that shouldn't be connected to our network, organizing meetings for colleagues who haven't realized yet that death might be nothing more than a change in status, a transfer to a different department in the same eternal corporation. And in 2 weeks, I'll discover whether that transfer is permanent or if it's simply another kind of promotion. Story 13. On the cabin rental listing had mentioned rustic charm and authentic forest experience, but failed to mention the window that refused to show my face back to me. I'd driven 3 hours north of the city, seeking solitude after months of suffocating office politics and the slow dissolution of my marriage. The divorce papers sat unsigned in my glove compartment, another decision I couldn't bring myself to make. The rental seemed perfect, a small log cabin nestled deep in evergreen woods, far enough from civilization that my phone showed no signal bars. The place was exactly as advertised: weathered cedar walls, a stone fireplace that dominated the main room, and windows that framed the forest like living paintings, except for the one in the bedroom. I noticed it immediately when I carried my duffel bag upstairs. Every other window in the cabin reflected my image clearly, sometimes startlingly so in the late afternoon light. But the bedroom window, positioned directly across from the bed, remained stubbornly opaque, despite being made of the same glass as the others. When I stood before it, I saw only darkness, as if someone had painted the other side black. The logical part of my mind offered explanations. Perhaps the window faced north, creating an optical illusion. Maybe the glass was tinted differently, or dirt on the exterior absorbed the light. I even checked outside, walking the perimeter of the cabin, but the window looked perfectly normal from the forest side. Clear glass reflecting sky and tree branches. That first evening, I convinced myself it was nothing more than a quirk of the architecture. I cooked a simple dinner on the gas stove, built a fire, and settled in with a book I'd been meaning to finish for months. The silence felt profound after the constant urban hum I'd grown accustomed to. No traffic, no neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls, no notification chimes from devices demanding attention. But silence, I discovered, has its own weight. Around 11, I climbed the narrow stairs to the bedroom. The window loomed larger in the darkness, a black rectangle that seemed to absorb what little moonlight filtered through the trees. I changed into sleep clothes and brushed my teeth at the small sink in the corner, catching my reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. Tired eyes, stubble I hadn't bothered shaving, the kind of hollow look that comes from too many sleepless nights. When I turned back toward the bed, something made me pause. The window wasn't completely dark anymore. For just a moment, maybe 3 seconds, I could swear I saw a shape behind my reflection. Not my reflection, but something standing where I stood, occupying the same space. The figure appeared taller than me, broader through the shoulders, with features I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. Then it was gone, and the window returned to its impenetrable blackness. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached the glass. I pressed my face close, cupping my hands around my eyes to block out any interior light. Nothing, just darkness so complete it seemed solid. Sleep came reluctantly that night, punctuated by dreams of faceless figures standing at the foot of my bed. I woke repeatedly, always with the uncomfortable sensation that I was being watched, always turning my eyes toward that damned window. The second day passed quietly enough. I hiked the nearby trails, breathing in pine-scented air and trying to clear my head of both supernatural nonsense and the very real problems waiting back in the city. The exercise helped. By evening, I'd almost convinced myself that exhaustion and stress had manufactured the previous night's hallucination. Almost. The figure appeared again around midnight, and this time, it moved. I'd been reading in bed, occasionally glancing at the window out of some compulsive need to monitor it. When the darkness shifted, revealing that impossible reflection, the shape raised one arm in what might have been a wave, or a warning. The gesture was slow, deliberate, lasting just long enough for me to register it before the window went black again. This time I didn't approach the glass. Instead, I grabbed my phone and turned on its flashlight, sweeping the beam across the window's surface. The light revealed nothing unusual, just ordinary glass reflecting the LED glare back at me. But when I lowered the phone, the figure was there again, closer now. Close enough that I could make out the suggestion of facial features, though they remained frustratingly indistinct. We stared at each other through the glass for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then it raised both hands and pressed them against the window from the inside. From the inside. The impossibility of it sent ice through my veins. I was inside the cabin, alone, yet this thing appeared to be standing in the same room with me, its palms flat against the glass from my side. When I scrambled off the bed and looked around the room, I saw nothing. No intruder, no disturbance, no explanation for what I was seeing. I spent the rest of the night in the main room downstairs, feeding logs to the fire and telling myself that stress manifested in strange ways. People had psychological breaks all the time. The divorce, the job pressure, the isolation. It all added up to a mind playing tricks on itself. But the rational explanations felt increasingly hollow. The third night brought new horrors. I'd moved a chair downstairs, determined to sleep by the fireplace rather than face that window again. But around 2 in the morning I heard it. A soft tapping against glass, rhythmic and purposeful. The sound came from directly above, from the bedroom window. Tap, tap, tap. Each knock sent a tremor through the cabin's frame. I sat frozen in my chair, watching shadows dance on the walls as the fire crackled and popped. The tapping continued for several minutes before falling silent. Then came the sound of something sliding down the glass, like fingernails dragging across the surface. When morning arrived, I forced myself to investigate. The bedroom looked exactly as I'd left it, but the window bore evidence of the night's visitation. A handprint marked the glass, not on the outside where rain or animals might have left it, but on the inside surface. The print was larger than my own hand, with fingers that seemed too long for human proportions. I cleaned it away with paper towels and glass cleaner, scrubbing until my arms ached. But as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from somewhere behind the glass, somewhere that shouldn't exist. That afternoon, I called the rental agency from my car, driving to a spot where my phone caught a single bar of service. The woman who answered sounded genuinely concerned when I described the window's behavior. "Are you talking about the Chapman cabin?" she asked. "On Millfield Road?" When I confirmed, she was quiet for a long moment. Then, "We've had a few complaints about that property over the years. Nothing substantial. Just guests who said they felt uncomfortable. We always assumed it was the isolation getting to people." "What kind of complaints?" "Oh, city folks not used to how quiet it gets out there. Reports of strange noises, feeling watched. One guest mentioned problems with the upstairs window specifically." She paused. "Look, we can move you to another property if you'd prefer. There's a larger cabin about 15 minutes south." I declined the offer. Whatever was happening, running away felt like admitting defeat. Besides, I only had 2 nights left on my reservation. The 4th night changed everything. I'd barricaded myself in the main room again, but sleep proved impossible. Every small sound, the cabin settling, wind in the trees, an owl calling in the distance, sent adrenaline coursing through my system. Around 3 a.m. I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was trying not to be heard but failing. They paused at the top of the staircase, directly above where I sat. Then came the sound of movement in the bedroom, not frantic or violent, but purposeful, methodical. The tapping resumed, but different this time. Instead of rhythmic knocks, it sounded like someone trying to break through the glass from the inside. Each impact was harder than the last, accompanied by a strange scratching noise that made my teeth ache. When the sounds finally stopped, I waited until dawn before going upstairs. The window was gone. Not broken, gone. Where glass should have been, only a rectangular hole remained, its edges smooth as if the window had simply dissolved. Cold air flowed through the opening, carrying the scent of pine and something else I couldn't identify. Something organic and unpleasant. But it was the footprints that truly terrified me. Wet marks covered the bedroom floor, not the clean outline of shoes or boots, but irregular shapes that suggested bare feet. They started at the empty window frame and traced a path around the room, pausing at the foot of the bed, the closet door, the bathroom entrance, as if something had methodically explored every corner of the space. The prints were still damp. I packed my things with shaking hands, throwing clothes and toiletries into my bag without care for organization. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. A break-in, vandalism, some elaborate practical joke, but none fit the evidence. Windows didn't just disappear, and wet footprints didn't manifest from nothing. As I loaded my car, I took one last look at the cabin. From the outside, the bedroom window appeared perfectly normal, glass intact, reflecting the morning sky. But when I drove around to check the other side, I found only forest. No window, no opening, just solid log wall covered in climbing ivy. The drive back to the city passed in a haze of confusion and dread. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that tall figure standing in the road behind me. But the highway remained empty, and gradually the familiar sounds of traffic and civilization helped ground me in reality. or what I hoped was reality. Now, weeks later, I've returned to my normal routine. The divorce papers are signed and filed. I've started seeing a therapist who specializes in stress-related disorders. She's helped me understand how isolation and emotional trauma can manifest in seemingly supernatural experiences. But I haven't told her about the photographs on my phone. 3 images, taken that final morning before I left the cabin. In each one, the bedroom window appears as it should, clear glass reflecting trees and sky. But if you look carefully at the reflection, really study it, you can see something that shouldn't be there. A figure standing behind the camera, behind where I was standing when I took the pictures. Tall, broad-shouldered, with features that remain frustratingly unclear, no matter how much I zoom in or adjust the contrast. In the first photo, it's barely visible, just a suggestion of human shape. In the second, it's clearer, more defined. By the third, it appears to be reaching toward the camera with hands that seem too large, fingers too long. I've shown the images to friends, to my therapist, to anyone willing to look. They all see the same thing I do in the reflection. Nothing, just trees and empty sky. But late at night, when sleep eludes me and the city feels too quiet despite its constant noise, I scroll through those photos again. And every time that figure seems a little closer to the camera, a little more real. Yesterday I noticed something new. In the background of my apartment's bathroom mirror, barely visible in the reflection of the reflection, stands a familiar shape. Watching. Waiting. I'm beginning to think some windows reflect more than just our image. Some show us things that exist in spaces between spaces, realities that overlap our own in ways we're not meant to understand. And sometimes, those things find ways to follow us home. Story 14. The floorboards above my head groaned with the weight of something that shouldn't exist. I'd been staring at the water-stained ceiling for 3 hours now, watching shadows dance across its yellowed surface in the dim lamplight. The old inn creaked and settled around me like arthritic bones, but what I heard wasn't the natural conversation of an aging building. It was deliberate, methodical, hungry. Something was dragging furniture across the attic floor. I'd arrived at Millbrook Inn 2 days earlier, drawn by its promise of authentic Victorian charm and rates that seemed too good to be true. Now I understood why. The place reeked of neglect disguised as rustic character, wallpaper peeling like diseased skin, carpets worn thin as cobwebs, and a pervasive dampness that clung to everything like guilty secrets. But it was the owner's warning that should have sent me running. Harold Wickham was a gaunt man with fingers stained permanent yellow from decades of cigarettes. When he handed me the brass room key, his grip lingered a moment too long, his watery eyes studying my face with unsettling intensity. "Room 12, second floor," he'd said, his voice carrying the rasp of old tobacco. "Breakfast is at 8. Don't go wandering at night. These old places have their quirks." Then, almost as an afterthought, "And stay away from the attic stairs. Door's been sealed for good reason. Safety hazard, you understand." I'd nodded politely, thinking nothing of it. Old buildings always had their off-limits areas, structural damage, asbestos, the usual suspects. But now, lying rigid beneath threadbare sheets as something walked overhead with measured, deliberate steps, I wondered what kind of safety hazard made sounds like that. The footsteps paused directly above my bed. My breath caught in my throat. The silence stretched, thick and expectant, until the air itself seemed to throb with waiting. Then came a new sound, a slow, scraping drag, as if something heavy was being pulled across the wooden floor. It moved from one end of the attic to the other, paused, then returned, tracing the same path with mechanical precision. Back and forth, back and forth. I pressed my palms against my ears, but the sound seemed to bypass them entirely, vibrating through the building's bones into my skull. When it finally stopped, the silence was somehow worse, pregnant with the sense of being watched by eyes I couldn't see. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no peace. The second night was when everything changed. I'd spent the day exploring the town, trying to shake off the previous night's unease. Millbrook was the kind of place where time seemed to have forgotten to move forward. A single main street lined with shops that looked like movie sets, populated by locals who watched strangers with the wariness of people protecting ancient secrets. When I asked about the inn's history at the general store, the elderly clerk's smile faltered. "Oh, the Wickham place," she'd said, suddenly very busy rearranging already perfect displays. "Been in the family for generations. They don't much like talking about it." But she'd given me enough. The inn had been built in 1887 by Harold's great-grandfather, a man named Ezekiel Wickham who'd made his fortune in ways the locals preferred not to discuss. The attic had been sealed after an incident in 1923, something about a guest who'd broken into the forbidden space and been found 3 days later, catatonic and babbling about the collector who lived in the walls. By the time I returned to my room that evening, my nerves were already frayed. The rational part of my mind insisted it was just old building settling, pipes knocking, the usual suspects that plagued century-old structures. But rationality is a fragile thing when darkness falls and you're alone with your fears. The sounds began again at 2:17 a.m. I know because I'd been watching the digital clock's green numbers like a lifeline. But this time was different. Worse. The footsteps weren't just walking anymore. They were searching. I heard what sounded like boxes being moved, heavy objects scraped across the floor, and underneath it all a rhythmic tapping, methodical and patient, like someone taking inventory. Then came the sound that made my blood turn to ice water, a long, drawn-out scraping, as if fingernails were being dragged across wood. That's when the lights began to flicker. The lamp beside my bed stuttered and dimmed, casting wild shadows that seemed to writhe with lives of their own. In the chaotic dance of light and darkness, I saw it. A shadow that didn't belong, pooling in the corner where the ceiling met the wall. It moved independently of the flickering light, growing darker and more defined until it resembled a pointing finger, aimed directly at the door, at the attic stairs. I squeezed my eyes shut, counting backwards from 100, trying to convince myself it was just pareidolia, the mind's tendency to find patterns where none existed. But when I opened them again, the shadow was still there, still pointing, and now I could swear I saw it beckoning. The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath began to mist, and frost formed delicate patterns on the window glass despite the autumn warmth outside. The smell hit me then. Old wood and dust, yes, but underneath that, something else. Something that reminded me of places where things had been forgotten for too long. The sounds from above stopped abruptly, leaving only the electric hum of the struggling lamp and my own ragged breathing. In that suffocating silence, I heard something new, a soft creaking, like hinges that hadn't been used in decades slowly opening. The third night was when I realized I wasn't alone. Items had begun disappearing from my room. First it was small things. My reading glasses, a pen, loose change from the nightstand. I'd chalked it up to my own disorganization, the stress of sleepless nights making me forgetful. But then my wallet vanished, along with my car keys and the book I'd been reading. I searched everywhere, growing increasingly frantic as the shadows lengthened and evening approached. I was considering demanding a different room when I went to grab my jacket from the closet and found them. Everything was there, arranged in a neat line on the closet floor. But they weren't simply placed there, they were displayed. Positioned with obsessive precision, each item exactly 1 inch apart, forming a perfect row that pointed toward the door, toward the hallway, toward the attic stairs. My hands shook as I gathered my belongings. The arrangement was too deliberate, too purposeful to be anything but a message. But from whom? And what were they trying to tell me? That night, I lay in bed fully clothed, my phone in one hand and car keys in the other, ready to run at the first sign of trouble. But trouble, when it came, wasn't what I expected. The sounds from above were different now, softer, more intimate. Instead of heavy footsteps, I heard what could only be described as crawling. Something moving across the attic floor on hands and knees, or perhaps something larger dragging itself with deliberate slowness. The sound traced a pattern, from one corner to another, then back, like a predator pacing the confines of its cage. But gradually, the movements began to migrate, following the outline of my room directly below. Whatever was up there was mapping my space, learning the boundaries of my sanctuary. That's when I heard the scratching. It started as a faint rustling, like mice in the walls, but slowly intensified until it sounded like claws scoring wood. The noise seemed to come from everywhere at once: the ceiling, the walls, even the floor beneath my feet. I pressed my back against the headboard, scanning the room for any sign of intrusion. But the scratching seemed to exist just beyond perception, always in my peripheral vision, always one step ahead of my searching eyes. The room grew cold again, that same unnatural chill that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. My breath came in visible puffs, and ice crystals began forming on the inside of the windows. But it was what I saw in the frost that made me question my sanity. Shapes appeared in the ice, crude drawings that looked almost like symbols. They seemed random at first, but as more formed, I began to see the pattern. They were instructions, directions, a map leading from my room to somewhere else in the building, to the attic. I grabbed my phone and took pictures, desperate for proof that I wasn't losing my mind. But when I looked at the images, they showed only clear glass. The frost was gone. The symbols vanished as if they'd never existed. That's when I heard the voice. It wasn't quite a whisper, wasn't quite a breath, but something in between. A sound like wind through dry leaves, forming words just at the edge of comprehension. I strained to listen, my heart hammering against my ribs, and slowly made out what it was saying. Come up, come up, come up. I found the attic stairs the next morning. Sleep had been impossible after hearing that voice, so I'd spent the remaining hours until dawn pacing my room, jumping at every shadow, every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows. When pale sunlight finally crept through the curtains, I knew I needed answers. Harold Wickham was nowhere to be found. The front desk was abandoned. Breakfast was a cold pile of pastries under plastic wrap, and the entire inn felt hollow, as if I was the only living thing within its walls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by my own footsteps echoing through empty hallways. I searched methodically, room by room, until I found what I was looking for at the end of the third-floor corridor. The attic stairs were hidden behind a door that looked like all the others, except for the heavy padlock that had been holding it shut. The padlock that was now lying on the floor, its metal hasp twisted and broken, as if it had been torn apart by something with incredible strength. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, I could see wooden steps disappearing into darkness above. A musty, organic smell drifted down, the scent of old wood and dust, but underneath it, something else. Something that made my primitive brain scream warnings I couldn't quite translate. I should have run, should have grabbed my things, gotten in my car, and driven until Millbrook Inn was just a bad memory. Instead, I found myself reaching for the door handle, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain or resist. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed, each step echoing in the confined space like gunshots. The darkness seemed to press against me, thick and suffocating, and I had to pause several times to catch my breath. My phone's flashlight carved a weak cone of illumination that seemed to be absorbed by the shadows rather than dispelling them. At the top of the stairs, another door waited, this one standing wide open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. The attic beyond was larger than I'd expected, stretching across the entire length of the building. Weak daylight filtered through grimy windows, casting everything in shades of gray and brown. Dust motes danced in the stale air like tiny spirits, and cobwebs hung from the rafters like funeral shrouds. But it was what filled the space that made my blood turn to ice. The attic was crammed with belongings, suitcases, clothing, personal effects arranged in neat piles that stretched from wall to wall. Each collection was carefully organized, labeled with handwritten tags that bore names and dates. Some were recent, but others went back decades, their yellowed labels testament to how long this had been going on. I moved through the collections in a daze, reading the tags with growing horror. Sarah Chen, 2019. Michael Volkov, 2015. Elizabeth Hartley, 1987. Dozens of names, dozens of dates, all guests who had stayed at Millbrook Inn and left behind pieces of themselves. At the far end of the attic, I found my own belongings. My missing reading glasses sat on top of a neat pile that included items I hadn't even realized were gone. A comb, a receipt from the gas station, even the pen I'd been using to take notes. Everything was arranged with the same obsessive precision I'd seen in my closet, labeled with a fresh tag that bore my name and yesterday's date. That's when I heard the floorboards creak behind me. I turned slowly, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears, and saw Harold Wickham standing at the top of the stairs. But this wasn't the frail old man who had checked me in. This Wickham stood straighter, moved with purpose, and his watery eyes had been replaced by something sharp and predatory. "You weren't supposed to come up here," he said, his voice carrying none of its previous rasp. The door was locked for a reason. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The piles of belongings hemmed me in on all sides, a maze of other people's lives that had been cataloged and stored like trophies. "What is this place?" I managed to whisper. Wickham smiled, and in that expression I saw the truth. The inn hadn't been preserving the belongings of former guests. It had been collecting them, and not just their possessions. "Every old place needs a keeper," he said, moving closer with each word. "Someone to tend the collection, to make sure nothing is lost or forgotten. My great-grandfather understood that. He built this place to last, to preserve things that might otherwise slip away." I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help, but my pockets were empty. Looking down at the pile bearing my name, I saw it there, my phone, my keys, my wallet, everything that connected me to the outside world. "The guests always try to leave eventually," Wickham continued, his smile growing wider. "But they never really go. They become part of the collection, caretakers like me. The inn takes care of them, and they take care of the inn." That's when I noticed the other shapes moving in the shadows between the piles. Human figures, but wrong somehow. Too still, too quiet, too focused on their endless organizing and cataloging. Guests who had checked in but never checked out, forever tending their collections in the dusty twilight of the attic. "The sounds you heard," Wickham said, as if reading my thoughts, "were them welcoming you, getting your space ready. They're very excited to have a new colleague." I ran. Pushing past Wickham, I threw myself down the stairs 3 at a time, my only thought to reach my car and escape. Behind me I heard no pursuit, only laughter, dry and dusty as autumn leaves. I burst through the inn's front door and into the parking lot, gasping for air that tasted like freedom. My car sat where I'd left it, and I fumbled with the spare key I kept hidden under the rear bumper, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the lock. The engine started on the first try, and I reversed out of the parking space so fast the tires screamed on the asphalt. In my rearview mirror, I could see Wickham standing in the doorway, watching my escape with that same terrible smile. But as I reached the main road, something made me look back one final time. The inn looked different in the daylight, smaller somehow, shabbier. The windows were boarded up, and a condemned sign hung crooked from the front gate. Weeds grew through cracks in the parking lot, and the whole place had the abandoned look of a building that hadn't seen guests in years. I stopped the car and stared, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The inn where I'd spent 3 terrifying nights was clearly derelict, had been for some time, but my suitcase was in the back seat, my belongings were accounted for, and my phone showed photos of the room I'd stayed in. Except now, looking at those photos, I could see they showed only empty rooms filled with dust and decay. I drove away and never looked back, but sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I still hear them. The sounds of furniture being moved, of careful footsteps arranging invisible collections. And I wonder if what I escaped was real, or if somewhere in the shadows of my mind, I'm still there in that attic, carefully organizing someone else's belongings while I wait for the next guest to arrive. The rational part of my mind insists it was just stress, exhaustion, a breakdown brought on by too much work and too little sleep. But late at night, when the darkness presses close and the old walls of my apartment creak and settle, I find myself checking and rechecking that my belongings are where I left them, because sometimes I swear they've been moved, arranged in neat lines, pointing toward the door.